They say power is the art of making others kneel. But what happens when the man who conquered a kingdom finds himself on his knees before a woman who owns nothing but the truth? Stay with me until the end, because what unfolds in Ravenshire isn't just a love story, it's a reckoning. The snowstorm hit Ravenshire like God's own fist against stone. Lucian Mordain stood at the tower window watching white death devour his duchy. One gloved hand pressed flat against glass cold enough to burn skin. Beyond the frost-etched panes, the capital sprawled beneath him like a corpse wrapped in white silk. Smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys. Torches flickered against the wind like prayers nobody bothered answering anymore. Somewhere down there, people were freezing to death in alleyways while calling his name like a curse they'd learned to swallow.
He didn't care.
Caring was the luxury of weak men who confused mercy with strength. His father had cared once, cared enough to get himself killed and leave Lucian holding a duchy one conspiracy away from collapse. 20 years since they'd found Lord Cedric Mordain's carriage overturned on the northern road, horses slaughtered, blood painting snow the color of rubies. 20 years since a 10-year-old boy inherited a title too heavy for adult shoulders and learned that England's nobility would eat their young if it meant gaining territory. Behind him, the study door opened without permission. Only one person in Ravenshire possessed that particular brand of arrogance. Lord Harwick, bring me good news or get out. Lucien didn't turn from the window. I'm not in the mood for incompetence tonight. The elderly advisor stepped into the firelight, his face carved from 70 years of political survival. Your Grace, the Merchants' Guild is demanding an audience. The grain shortage
Has nothing to do with me.
Lucien's reflection in the glass showed a man carved from ice and inherited fury, 30 years old and already ancient in the eyes. They want grain. They pay market price plus the Duke's fee. No exceptions. No charity. They survive winter or they don't, but they'll do it without bleeding my coffers dry. 300 families will starve before spring. Then they should have prepared better. Lucien finally turned, his movement precise as a blade leaving its sheath. My responsibility is maintaining order, not nursing the incompetent through their own failures. Ravenshire stays strong because I make hard choices while other men whimper about compassion. Harwick's jaw tightened. Your father would have... My father died because he was soft. The words came out colder than the storm outside. He trusted the wrong people, extended mercy to vipers who repaid him with murder. I learned from his mistake. Harwick. The only thing keeping this duchy from tearing itself apart is fear. Fear of what I'll do to anyone who challenges my authority. The moment I show weakness, every ambitious bastard from London to Edinburgh will come for Ravenshire with knives hidden behind diplomatic smiles. The old advisor studied him with something that might have been pity if Lucian gave a damn about being pitied. You're becoming the thing you claim to protect us from. No. Lucian moved to the massive oak desk where maps of his territory sprawled like dissected organs. I'm becoming the thing that keeps predators away from my door. There's a difference. The winter assembly begins in 3 weeks. Parliament expects you to announce your engagement to Lady Evelyn Harcourt. The Union would secure political alliances, strengthen trade agreements, give the Harcourt family enough influence to poison Ravenshire from the inside. Lucian's fingers traced the borders of his duchy on the map, each village and estate purchased with blood and brutality his father never possessed the stomach for. I know what the marriage accomplishes, Harwick. I also know that the moment I put a ring on Evelyn's finger, her father gains a foothold in my territory that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to remove. Then what's your alternative? You need an heir. What the duchy needs is a duke who doesn't get manipulated by pretty faces and political pressure. Lucien looked up, his eyes the color of winter storms over iron. I'll marry when it serves Ravenshire's interests, not when Parliament gets nervous about succession. Until then, tell the Harcourt family I'm considering their very generous offer. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Harwick gathered the documents he'd brought, his movements stiff with disapproval. One day, Your Grace, you'll discover that ruling through fear eventually runs out of people to terrify. Then I'll cross that bridge when England stops being full of ambitious bastards. Lucien dismissed him with a gesture that had ended 1,000 conversations. Now get out. I have work to do. The door closed with a sound like a coffin sealing. Alone again, Lucien returned to the window. The storm had intensified, turning Ravenshire into a landscape from old nightmares. Snow piled against buildings like nature trying to bury civilization one flake at a time. Wind howled through the castle's stone corridors, making the ancient fortress sound alive and hungry. Somewhere in the darkness below, a bell tolled midnight. Lucian pressed his forehead against the frozen glass and allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of something that wasn't strength. 30 seconds to remember what his father's laugh sounded like. 30 seconds to wonder if Lord Cedric Mordain would recognize the monster his son had become. 30 seconds to acknowledge the hollow space where normal men kept things like joy and hope and the capacity to love something other than power. Then the 30 seconds ended. He straightened, adjusting his coat with military precision. Weakness invited betrayal. Sentiment got men killed. His father had proven that with his own blood painting snow 20 years ago. Lucien had built Ravenshire into an iron fortress specifically because he refused to repeat Cedric's mistakes. If that meant ruling through fear instead of love, so be it. Fear lasted longer anyway. The study door opened again without warning. Captain Thorne entered, snow still melting on his uniform, his face carrying news that made Lucien's instincts sharpen like blades. "Your Grace, we've got a situation in the lower city. One of the river patrols found something." Lucien's hand moved to the pistol he kept loaded on the desk. "Found what?" "A man. Half dead from exposure, badly wounded." The captain hesitated, which meant whatever came next was going to complicate Lucien's night. He was mumbling when we pulled him out of the snow, kept repeating the same thing over and over. Which was, "Your father's name." The world tilted sideways for exactly one heartbeat before Lucien's training locked everything down again. His face showed nothing. His voice emerged steady as execution orders. "Explain." The man kept saying Cedric Mordain like a prayer or a confession. Thorne stepped closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "Your Grace, I've served this house for 15 years. I was at your father's funeral. I know what I'm about to say sounds impossible, but nothing's impossible in England when enough money and ambition get involved." Lucien's mind raced through possibilities like cards being dealt in a lethal game. "Where is he now?" "The lower city. Some woman pulled him off the street before we could grab him. We tracked her to a building near the market district, but she's gone to ground. Could be hiding him anywhere in that maze." Lucien moved toward the door, his movements predatory and precise. "Assemble a squad. Quiet operation. No public spectacle. I want every building in that sector searched roof to cellar. Find this woman, find this man, and bring them both to me. Alive. And if they resist, then you'd better hope you kill them quickly, because if you damage my only lead to whoever's using my father's name for whatever game they're playing, I'll have you cleaning latrines until your grandchildren retire." Lucien grabbed his coat from the chair, already calculating angles. How long since the patrols found him? Maybe 2 hours. Then we've already lost time we can't afford. Move. They descended through Ravenshire Castle like wolves hunting in formation. The fortress had stood for 3 centuries, each generation of Mordainis adding their own scars to the stone. Gothic arches stretched overhead like ribs in a giant skeleton. Torchlight painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. Guards snapped to attention as their duke passed, eyes forward, hands on weapons. The discipline Lucien had beaten into them showing in every rigid spine. The courtyard swallowed them in frozen chaos. Wind screamed between buildings, carrying snow sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath creating clouds of steam that vanished into darkness. Lucien swung into his saddle with the ease of a man who'd learned to ride before he learned fear meant something other than tactical data. 6 riders followed him through Ravenshire's gates. The city unfolded before them like a map drawn in misery. Narrow streets twisted between buildings that leaned together like drunks sharing secrets. Snow turned every surface treacherous. The few people still outside at this hour pressed themselves into doorways when the Duke's party thundered past, their faces showing the kind of terror that came from knowing exactly who ruled their world and what he'd do to maintain that rule. Lucien saw a woman clutching a child against her chest, both of them wrapped in rags that wouldn't keep a dog warm. Saw an old man collapse beside a frozen fountain, maybe sleeping, probably dead, definitely not his problem. Saw the poverty and desperation his duchy was built on top of, like a palace constructed over a mass grave. He kept riding. The market district materialized from the storm like a ghost of commerce. Stalls stood empty, their canvas coverings thrashing in the wind. Snow had buried whatever garbage and desperation the day's trading had left behind. Thorn raised one fist, bringing the squad to a halt outside a building that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. Here. The captain pointed to a door hanging crooked on broken hinges. She took him inside. Trail goes cold after that. Then we make it warm again. Lucien dismounted, his boots hitting cobblestones with sounds like coffin nails driving home. Spread out. I want this entire block locked down. Nobody in or out until I say otherwise. The soldiers moved with brutal efficiency, surrounding the building like a noose tightening. Lucien approached the door, one hand on his pistol, every sense alert for the trap. This entire situation screamed at him, using his father's name, appearing during the worst storm in 20 years, getting rescued by some woman with enough courage or stupidity to interfere with ducal business. Nothing about this was coincidence. He kicked the door open. The interior hit him with smells of rot, urine, and human desperation concentrated into architectural form. A single room stretched before him, its floor covered in straw that hadn't been changed since England still had a queen. Rats scattered from his entrance. Moonlight through broken windows illuminated exactly nothing useful. Empty. Lucian's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. He moved through the space anyway, checking corners, looking for evidence someone had been here recently. His boot struck something that clattered across the floor. He bent, retrieving a tin cup still carrying residual warmth. "Your Grace!" Thorn appeared in the doorway. We found tracks leading toward the river. Fresh, maybe 30 minutes old. 2 sets of footprints, one significantly larger than the other. The woman and her mysterious cargo. Lucien straightened, his mind already tracking possibilities. She's running, which means she knows we're hunting her. Question is whether she understands what she's protecting, or if she's just another street rat who grabs something valuable without realizing it'll get her killed. Orders? We follow the river. She's looking for either escape or shelter, and in this storm, shelter's the smarter bet. Check every warehouse, every abandoned building, every hole in the ground large enough to hide 2 people. Lucien emerged back into the storm, snow immediately coating his shoulders, like nature trying to bury him. And Thorn. When we find them, I handle the interrogation personally. Nobody else touches either of them until I've extracted every piece of information they possess. Understood. They mounted again, following the riverbank through darkness so complete it felt like riding into oblivion. The water moved beside them, black and hungry, its surface occasionally catching moonlight like scattered diamonds over oil. Buildings rose on either side, warehouses and workshops closed for winter, their windows dark as dead eyes watching the hunt. Lucien's thoughts circled the same questions over and over. If someone was using his father's name, they had an agenda. Blackmail, political manipulation. Destabilizing his rule by suggesting Lord Cedric's death wasn't the clean assassination everyone believed. The timing alone, 3 weeks before the winter assembly, right when he needed to appear strongest, screamed coordination. But whose coordination? The Harcourt family. They had the most to gain from creating chaos around the engagement announcement. Lord Harwick, bitter about being sidelined. Parliament itself, nervous about a duke who refused to play their political games. Half of England's nobility wanted Ravenshire's wealth, and the other half wanted its strategic position. Enemies weren't the problem. Having too many enemies to track was the problem. There. Thorn pointed to a warehouse squatting beside the frozen river like a toad carved from stone, light showing through cracks in the walls. Someone's definitely inside. Lucien raised his hand, halting the squad. He studied the building, tracking sight lines, identifying escape routes, calculating how many ways this could go wrong if his quarry decided fighting was better than surrendering. The smart play would be surrounding the structure and starving them out. He dismounted and walked straight for the front door instead. Because the smart play was for men who had something to lose, and Lucien had built his entire rule on making enemies understand he'd burn the world down before showing weakness. If the woman inside thought hiding would save her, she was about to learn a lesson in exactly how far the Duke of Ravenshire would go to protect his authority. He kicked the warehouse door hard enough to tear it from its hinges. The interior opened before him like a stage set for tragedy. Crates stacked to the ceiling created corridors of shadow and possibility. A single lantern burned near the back, its light barely strong enough to matter. And there, beside a fire burning in a barrel, stood a woman who looked like she'd been assembled from starvation and defiance in equal measure. She held a knife, Not a kitchen blade or a letter opener, but an actual fighting knife. The kind soldiers carried into battles they didn't expect to survive. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes met his without flinching. And despite the rags she wore, despite the dirt on her face, and the desperation in every line of her posture, she stood between him and whatever she was protecting like she actually believed she could stop him. Lucien almost laughed. "You're trespassing on ducal property." His voice echoed through the warehouse, filling the space with authority that had broken harder men than one starving woman. "You're harboring someone I want to question. And you're currently pointing a weapon at the Duke of Ravenshire, which is treason punishable by hanging. Lower the knife, step aside, and maybe you'll live long enough to regret tonight's choices." The woman's grip tightened on the blade. He's hurt. He needs help, not interrogation. What he needs is irrelevant. What I need is answers. Lucien moved closer, his boots echoing on the warehouse floor. Last chance. Move or I move you. She didn't move. Something flickered in Lucien's chest. Some emotion he'd spent 20 years training himself not to feel. Not respect, exactly. Not admiration. But a distant cousin to both. The recognition that this woman possessed something he'd murdered in himself years ago. The willingness to stand for principle even when principle would get you killed. He drew his pistol in one smooth motion and aimed it directly at her heart. Final warning. Her chin lifted. "Do what you have to do. But you're not touching him until I know what you want with him." Lucien's finger rested on the trigger. 1 ounce of pressure. That's all it would take to remove this obstacle and get on with extracting information from whoever she was protecting. One death between him and answers. He'd killed for less, ordered executions for infractions smaller than this. One more body wouldn't even register on the scale he'd built measuring necessary brutality against effective rule. His hand didn't move. Interesting. He studied her with new attention, cataloging details. Early 20s, maybe. Malnourished but not broken by it. Hands showing calluses from hard labor. Eyes carrying intelligence that poverty hadn't managed to kill yet. This woman had survived things that would have destroyed softer people, and survival built a particular kind of strength Lucien recognized because he'd forged the same steel in himself. "What's your name?" He didn't lower the pistol, but his finger eased off the trigger. She hesitated, clearly weighing the tactical value of honesty against whatever game she thought she was playing. "Seraphina." "Seraphina Vale." "Well, Seraphina Vale, you've created an interesting situation." Lucien gestured with the gun toward whatever she was protecting behind the crates. "That man you're defending is either using my dead father's name as some kind of leverage, or he's part of a conspiracy I'm going to dismantle piece by bloody piece. Either way, I will get my answers. The only question is whether you die in the process or live long enough to realize that protecting him was the worst decision you've ever made. He's your father." 3 words that hit Lucien like cannon fire to the chest. His expression didn't change. 20 years of political warfare had taught him to control every muscle in his face, even when his world was ending. But inside, something cracked. Some wall he'd built between himself and the past, some barrier keeping memory at bay, developed a fracture that spread like ice across glass. "Explain." The word came out steady, calm, betraying nothing of the chaos behind it. Seraphina's knife lowered slightly. "I found him by the river. He was dying, mumbling about Ravenshire, about someone named Lucien." She swallowed hard, her throat working. "He has your eyes, same color, same intensity. And when he looks at me, it's like he's seen through me the exact same way you are right now. That's not proof. That's observation." Lucien kept his weapon trained on her even as his mind raced through implications. Half of England has gray eyes. Intensity isn't hereditary. You're describing coincidence, not evidence. Then come see for yourself. She stepped aside. Behind the crates, illuminated by flickering firelight, lay a man who turned Lucien's blood to ice water in his veins. The face was older, scarred, weathered by 2 decades of whatever hell he'd survived. But the bone structure remained, the architecture underneath skin and suffering that Lucien had studied in family portraits since childhood. The same sharp jaw, the same aristocratic nose, the same mouth Lucien saw every morning in his shaving mirror. Lord Cedric Mordain opened his eyes and smiled at his son like death itself had taken a holiday. "Lucien." The voice was broken gravel, barely human, but the inflection carried every memory of bedtime stories and writing lessons. and the thousand small moments before politics and murder had turned a boy into something cold enough to rule. Lucian stood frozen, the pistol suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds in his hand, his entire world rearranging itself around this impossibility made flesh. Thorn burst through the door behind him, soldiers flooding into the warehouse with weapons drawn. "Your Grace, are you—" "Get out." Lucian's voice came from somewhere very far away. "All of you, now!" "But Your Grace, now!" They fled. Silence filled the warehouse like water filling a tomb. Lucian stared at the man on the floor, at this ghost wearing his father's face, at the impossibility that couldn't be real, but was lying there breathing and smiling and wrecking every certainty he'd built his life around. "You're dead." The words barely qualified as sound. "I buried you. I stood at your grave and swore I'd be stronger than you were. I built Ravenshire into a fortress specifically because you died, proving mercy gets men killed. And yet here I am." Cedric coughed, the sound wet and horrible. "Disappointed?" Lucian's hands started shaking. 20 years of iron control, 20 years of never showing weakness, and his hands were shaking like a child's. The pistol clattered to the floor. He sank to his knees, staring at this impossible resurrection, and felt something he'd thought he'd killed forever break free inside his chest. "What happened to you?" Cedric's smile turned bitter. "That's a long story, son. One that involves betrayal, conspiracy, and enemies closer than you think. But first," he gestured weakly toward Serafina, who stood watching this reunion like she'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. "Thank the woman who saved my life. I wouldn't have survived another hour without her." Lucian looked up at Serafina Vale, this stranger who'd defied him, challenged him, held a knife on him, and somehow managed to resurrect his father from 20 years of death. She met his gaze without backing down, her chin still lifted, her spine still straight despite every reason she had to be terrified. "Why?" His voice came out raw. "Why save him? You didn't know who he was. You could have left him to die and avoided this entire mess. Because that's not who I am." Simple words, delivered like a challenge. "I don't leave people to freeze when I can help them, even when helping them brings the Duke of Ravenshire and his entire military force down on my head. You're either the bravest person I've ever met." Lucian stood slowly, his legs feeling like someone else's limbs attached to his body. Or the most foolish. Maybe both. They stared at each other across the firelight, across the impossible gulf between Duke and street rat, across every social barrier that should have made this moment laughable. But nothing about this was funny. Not the father returned from death. Not the woman who defied every survival instinct to do the right thing. Not the way Lucian's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him like walls made of lies finally giving up the fight. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling between buildings like all of England was screaming. And in a warehouse beside a frozen river, surrounded by crates and shadows and impossibilities made real, Lucian Mordain realized that everything he thought he knew about power, control, and the iron rules that kept men safe was about to be tested in ways no amount of brutality could prepare him for. Because his father was alive. And the woman who'd saved him was looking at Lucian like she could see straight through the armor to the frightened child he'd buried beneath 20 years of necessary cruelty. "What happens now?" Serafina's question hung in the air like smoke. Lucian had no answer. For the first time in 20 years, the Duke of Ravenshire had absolutely no idea what came next. The silence inside the warehouse stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap and draw blood when it broke. Lucian stared at the ghost of his father sprawled on the filthy floor, watching Cedric's chest rise and fall with breaths that shouldn't exist. 20 years. 20 years of building walls high enough that memory couldn't climb over them. 20 years of turning grief into something useful, something sharp enough to cut anyone who came too close. And now this woman, this street rat with a knife and principles she couldn't afford, had torn it all down in one night. "We need to move him." Serafina's voice cut through the moment like glass breaking. "He needs proper medical attention, not whatever you're planning to do with him." Lucian's eyes snapped to her, cold fury replacing the shock that had briefly cracked his armor. "You don't give me orders. You don't tell me what my father needs. You don't tell me anything. Then what are you going to do?" She didn't flinch. Stand here staring at him until he bleeds out? Because that wound in his side is infected and he's running a fever that'll kill him before morning if someone doesn't... "I know what infection looks like." Lucian's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, the tone he used right before men died. I've seen enough battlefield casualties to recognize when a man's dancing with death. What I don't know is why you think your opinion matters, when you're currently guilty of harboring someone who might be an imposter using my family's tragedy for leverage. He's not an imposter. Prove it. Serafina's jaw clenched. Look at him. Really, look at him. He has the same scar above his left eyebrow that's in every portrait of Lord Cedric in the castle gallery. Same hands. Same way of holding himself even when he's half dead. She stepped closer, her fear finally showing but not stopping her. I've lived on these streets my entire life, Your Grace. I know when someone's lying and when they're telling a truth so terrible they can barely speak it. That man is your father, and whatever happened to him, whatever kept him away for 20 years, it broke something in him that might never heal. Lucian turned back to Cedric, studying the face that should have been rotting in the family crypt. The scar was there, faded with time but unmistakable, a thin white line cutting through the left eyebrow exactly where family portraits showed it. His hands, even damaged and scarred, carried the same long fingers, the same aristocratic structure that had signed trade agreements and death warrants with equal elegance. Tell me what happened. Lucian knelt beside his father, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Tell me why I buried an empty casket. Tell me why you let me think you were dead while I turned myself into something you wouldn't recognize. Cedric's eyes opened fully for the first time, and Lucien saw pain there that went deeper than physical wounds. Pain that lived in the soul and bred the kind of damage no surgeon could fix. They took me. His voice was gravel scraping against rust. The night of the ambush. The Harcourt family and their allies. They needed me gone but not dead. Not yet. The Harcourts. Lucien's blood turned cold. The same family pushing for the marriage alliance. The same family that stood to gain everything if he sealed the engagement with Evelyn. They wanted Ravenshire. Cedric coughed and blood flecked his lips. Not through war. Too expensive. Through marriage and manipulation. But I wouldn't agree to the union between houses. I saw what they were. Vipers wrapped in silk and political promises. So they arranged an accident. Made it look like I died. Kept me locked in a cell beneath their estate for 2 years before I escaped. 2 years. Lucian's hands curled into fists. You were alive for 2 years and didn't find a way to send word. I tried? God, I tried. Cedric's laugh was broken glass. Every message intercepted, every attempted contact turned against me. They made sure the world believed Cedric Mordain was dead, and they made sure I believed my son was better off without a father weak enough to get captured. You were never weak. The words came out before Lucian could stop them, raw and honest in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be since childhood. You were kind. You believed in mercy and diplomacy and all the things that got you nearly killed. But you weren't weak. Maybe. Cedric's hand reached out, trembling. Or maybe weakness and kindness look the same when you're on your knees with a knife to your throat. Lucien didn't take the offered hand. Couldn't. Because touching this ghost would make it real, would force him to acknowledge that everything he'd built, every brutal choice, every execution, every time he'd chosen fear over compassion, had been constructed on a foundation of lies. Where have you been for 18 years? His voice came out flat. If you escaped after 2 years, where did you go? Why didn't you come home? Because by the time I got free, you'd already become the Iron Duke. Cedric's eyes held something that might have been pride or might have been grief. I watched from the shadows. Saw you transform Ravenshire from a duchy on the edge of collapse into a fortress no one dared challenge. Saw you make the hard choices I never had the stomach for. And I realized that coming back would only weaken what you'd built. You didn't need a ghost returning to remind everyone that Mordanes could be captured, could be broken. So you stayed away. Lucian stood, his movements sharp with barely controlled rage. You let me believe I was orphaned. Let me carry that weight alone. Let me turn into someone who rules through terror because I thought that was the only thing keeping us safe from whatever killed you. It was. Cedric struggled to sit up, and Serafina moved to help him despite Lucian's warning glare. Everything you became, every brutal choice you made, it worked. Ravenshire stands stronger than it ever did under my rule. You succeeded where I failed. No. Lucien's voice cut like a blade. I survived. There's a difference. I didn't fail because I didn't allow myself the luxury of trying anything that required trust. I assumed everyone was an enemy and treated them accordingly. And you're telling me it was all necessary because you got captured by the same family now trying to marry into our bloodline. The same family that's been positioning themselves for 20 years. Cedric's eyes hardened despite his physical weakness. The Harcourts didn't just want me gone. They wanted control of Ravenshire's trade routes, its military position, its wealth. Evelyn was 10 years old when they took me. They've been grooming her for this marriage since childhood, building a perfect weapon wrapped in beauty and political advantage. Then I'll destroy them. Simple words, delivered with absolute certainty. I'll dismantle the Harcourt family piece by piece until there's nothing left but ash and memory. You can't. Not without proof. Not without evidence that won't get dismissed as the ravings of a dead man returned. Cedric's hand pressed against his wounded side. They've spent 2 decades building legitimacy. You move against them without ironclad proof, and Parliament will turn on you. They'll call it paranoia, madness. They'll use it to strip your authority and put someone more controllable in your place. Lucian's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles, assessing threats. The Winter Assembly. 3 weeks away. Every major house in England gathering in one place. If he exposed the Harcourts there, in front of the entire aristocracy, with his father as living proof, Thorne's voice called from outside the warehouse. Your Grace, we need to move. The storm's getting worse, and the men are asking questions. Lucian walked to the door, his movements predatory despite the chaos in his head. He pushed it open just wide enough to speak through the gap. We're relocating to the castle. Prepare a closed carriage. No guards inside. No questions asked. And Thorne, if word of this gets out before I'm ready, I'll have you cleaning stables with your tongue until you die of old age. The captain's silhouette snapped to attention. Understood, Your Grace. The door closed again. Lucian turned back to find Serafina helping Cedric to his feet, her small frame supporting far more weight than should be possible. She looked up, meeting Lucien's gaze with that same fearless intensity that had made her pull a knife on him earlier. What happens to me? Her question was direct, blunt. Now that you have what you came for, what happens to the street rat who got in your way? You come with us. Lucian moved closer, studying her with new attention. You saved my father's life. You defied me to protect him. That makes you either an asset or a liability, and I haven't decided which yet. I'm not going to your castle. Serafina's chin lifted. I helped because it was right, not because I want anything from you. You don't have a choice. Lucian's voice dropped to something dangerous. You know too much. You've seen too much. I can't have you running around the lower city with information that could destroy everything if it reaches the wrong ears. So you're coming to Ravenshire Castle. You're staying there until this situation resolves. And if you're very lucky and very smart, you might live long enough to walk away when it's over. That's kidnapping. That's protective custody. Lucian smiled, and it was the expression that made hardened soldiers nervous. Semantics matter in politics, Miss Vale. I'm protecting a valuable witness, not abducting a civilian. The fact that your protection happens to involve locked doors and armed guards is simply prudent security. And if I refuse, then I'll have you dragged to the castle unconscious and wake you up in a cell. Lucian's smile vanished. Your choice. Walk with dignity or arrive as cargo. Either way, you're coming. They stared at each other across the firelight. 2 people from completely different worlds locked in a battle of wills that neither could afford to lose. Lucian needed her silence. Serafina needed her freedom. And somewhere between those 2 needs, something else flickered, a recognition that went deeper than the current standoff. Fine. Serafina's voice carried bitter acceptance. But when this is over, when your family politics are resolved and your father's safe, you let me go. No strings, no obligations. I help because people were in trouble, not because I want to be part of whatever game you're playing. Agreed. The lie came easily. Lucian had no intention of letting her walk away with the information she carried, but there was time to deal with that problem later. After the Harcourts were destroyed, after his father's return became public, after the Winter Assembly exploded into the political battlefield he was already planning, the carriage arrived minutes later, black as a coffin and unmarked. Lucian helped Cedric inside while Serafina climbed in under her own power, her pride refusing assistance even when it would have made things easier. The interior smelled of leather and old money, the seats soft enough to qualify as luxury after a lifetime sleeping on stone and straw. Thorne leaned close to the window. Your Grace, The patrols are reporting unusual activity near the Harcourt estate. Extra guards. Midnight meetings. Something's happening. Let it happen. Lucien's eyes never left his father's face. Whatever they're planning, they're about to discover that the dead don't stay buried as easily as they hoped. The carriage lurched into motion, iron wheels grinding over cobblestones turned treacherous with ice. Inside, the three passengers sat in silence, broken only by Cedric's labored breathing and the storm howling outside. Lucien watched Serafina from across the cabin, cataloging the way she held herself. Spine straight despite exhaustion, eyes alert despite the danger she'd walked into. Why, really? His question cut through the darkness. Why risk everything for a stranger? Serafina's eyes met his. Because I've been that stranger, left to die while people walked past pretending not to see. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to be different, to be better than the world that created me, I'd take it, even if it killed me. Noble sentiment. Lucien's voice carried something that wasn't quite mockery. Dangerous, but noble. You'd know about dangerous nobility. She didn't look away. You've built an entire rule on it. I've built a rule on necessity. Lucien leaned back against the seat, his body language relaxed but his eyes sharp as broken glass. Nobility is a luxury for people who can afford to survive their principles. I can't. Ravenshire can't. So I make the choices that keep us alive and deal with the moral implications later. And how's that working for you? The question carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity. It kept my duchy from being carved up by predators, kept my people fed during famines that destroyed other territories, kept foreign powers from using Ravenshire as a political game piece. Lucien's jaw tightened. It also cost me every relationship I ever had, turned me into someone who trusts no one, and apparently built a reputation terrifying enough that my own father stayed away, rather than risk weakening it. Maybe he was wrong. Serafina's voice was quiet. Maybe strength that can't tolerate compassion isn't really strength at all. Careful. Lucien's warning came soft and lethal. You're offering opinions on matters you don't understand. I understand survival. She leaned forward, and in the carriage's dim light, her eyes burned. I understand what it costs to live when everything's designed to kill you. And I understand that the moment you start believing fear is the only thing holding your world together, you've already lost the part of yourself that made ruling worthwhile in the first place. The carriage fell silent. Cedric's laugh broke the tension, weak but genuine. She's got your number, son. Sounds just like your mother used to talk to me when I got too caught up in duty and forgot about humanity. Mother died when I was 8. Lucien's voice flattened. I barely remember her lectures. You remember them. Cedric's eyes closed. You just spent 20 years pretending you didn't because remembering hurt too much. The castle gates materialized from the storm, like jaws opening to swallow them whole. Guards snapped to attention as the carriage passed, their faces carefully neutral despite the questions that must be burning behind their eyes. The Duke returning in an unmarked carriage at midnight with unknown passengers was exactly the kind of irregularity that started rumors. Lucien didn't care about rumors. Rumors could be killed. Truth was harder to bury. They entered through a side entrance, avoiding the main halls where servants and minor nobles might see. Lucien led them through corridors he'd known since childhood, passages that smelled of stone and secrets and 3 centuries of Mordain history. Tapestries watched their progress with woven eyes. Portraits of dead ancestors seemed to judge every step. He brought them to the East Wing, to rooms that hadn't been opened since his father's supposed death. The Duke's private chambers, locked and sealed and preserved exactly as Cedric had left them the morning he rode out to his arranged murder. Lucien pushed the door open. Dust swirled in candlelight. Furniture stood covered in white sheets like ghosts holding formation. Books lined the walls in perfect rows, their spines showing titles on philosophy and governance, and the careful balance between power and mercy that Cedric had spent his life trying to maintain. I had them sealed. Lucien's voice was barely audible. After the funeral, couldn't bear to change anything, couldn't bear to keep it the same, so I locked the door and pretended this part of the castle didn't exist. Cedric moved through the room like a man visiting his own tomb. His fingers traced the desk where he'd signed the duchy's business, the chair where he'd read before bed, the window overlooking gardens that had changed with 20 years of different gardeners' hands. You kept everything. Wonder colored his words. I thought you'd burn it all, erase every reminder. I tried. Lucien stood in the doorway, unable to enter fully. Couldn't make myself do it. So I locked it away instead and told myself that was the same thing as moving on. Serafina watched this exchange with eyes that saw too much. Watched the Iron Duke crack around the edges. Watched the ghost in human skin trying to reconcile past and present. Watched two men separated by death and resurrection try to find language for emotions neither knew how to express anymore. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Lucien opened it to find Dr. Winters, the castle physician, standing with his medical bag and a carefully neutral expression. Your Grace, I was told there was an urgent situation requiring discretion. There is. Lucien stepped aside. The man on the bed is your patient. The woman is under my protection. You speak to no one about either of them. Am I clear? Perfectly clear, Your Grace. The doctor moved to Cedric with professional efficiency, beginning his examination while Lucien pulled Serafina into the corridor outside. They stood in shadows painted by torchlight, their voices low enough that even the stones wouldn't remember what was said. You understand what happens if you betray me. It wasn't a question. What happens if word of my father's return reaches the wrong people before I'm ready to control the narrative? You'll kill me. Serafina said it like she was commenting on weather. Quick, if you're merciful. Slow, if you want to send a message. I don't want to kill you. The admission surprised them both, but I will if necessary. I've killed for less important reasons than protecting my family and my duchy. Don't make yourself a necessary casualty. Then don't make me a prisoner. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell smoke and river water on her clothes. I helped your father because it was right. I'll keep your secret because I gave you my word. But I won't be locked in some gilded cage while you play chess with people's lives. You'll be locked wherever I decide keeps you safest. Lucien's hand moved without conscious thought, his fingers catching her chin and tilting her face up so their eyes met. You don't get to negotiate terms. You don't get to make demands. You exist right now because I allow it. And that allowance can be revoked at any moment if you become more trouble than you're worth. Her breath caught. Not from fear, he could see that clearly, but from something else entirely. Something that made her pupils dilate and her pulse visible in her throat quicken just slightly. Then revoke it. The challenge came out breathless. If I'm such a problem, such a liability, end it now. Save yourself the trouble. Lucien's thumb traced her jawline without permission from his brain. I should. Every tactical instinct I possess is screaming that you're dangerous, that you'll complicate things, that mercy has no place in survival. But you won't. She didn't pull away, because despite everything you've turned yourself into, despite all the walls and brutality and iron control, there's still a piece of you that remembers what it was like before you had to become this. You don't know anything about me. I know that you kept your father's rooms sealed for 20 years instead of burning them. I know that you could have shot me in that warehouse but didn't. I know that right now, you're touching me like you're trying to remember what human connection feels like before you have to kill it again. Lucien's hand dropped like she'd burned him. He stepped back, his expression slamming shut like castle gates closing. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start planning how to destroy the Harcourts without bringing down the entire political structure of England in the process. Where am I sleeping? The room next to my father's, guarded, locked from the outside. Lucien's voice returned to its usual cold precision. Consider it protective custody with comfortable furniture. Consider it a prison with silk sheets. Call it whatever helps you sleep. He turned away. But remember that prisons keep things in and they keep things out. The Harcourts want my father dead, and anyone who knows he's alive silenced. Right now, those locked doors are the only thing standing between you and a very permanent solution to their problem. He walked away before she could respond, his boots echoing down corridors that had witnessed 3 centuries of Mordain's secrets. Behind him, he felt her eyes tracking his retreat, felt the weight of unspoken words and impossible attraction building between them like pressure before a storm. This was already complicated enough without adding desire to the equation. Lucien found Lord Harwick waiting in his study, the old advisor standing by the window with the patient posture of someone who'd learned long ago that the Duke's time moved according to its own rules.
You sent for me, Your Grace.
Lucien poured himself whiskey without offering any to his guest. The Harcourts. Tell me everything about their current political position, every alliance, every debt, every piece of leverage they hold. Harwick's eyes narrowed. May I ask what's prompted this sudden interest? No. Lucien drained the glass in one swallow. You may answer the question, or you may leave my service. Choose quickly. The advisor chose. The Harcourt family holds significant influence in Parliament through strategic marriages and financial backing of key ministers. Lord Edmund Harcourt controls trade agreements with 3 major ports. His daughter Evelyn has been positioned as the ideal match for your grace, specifically because the union would create an unbreakable power block. What are their vulnerabilities? Pride. Harwick said it immediately. They've built their entire strategy on appearing untouchable. Any public scandal would devastate their political capital. But your grace, without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, any move against them would be seen as paranoia or spite over the engagement pressure. What if I had evidence? Lucian turned from the window. What if I had proof of conspiracy, treason, and 20 years of manipulation designed to seize control of Ravenshire? Then I'd ask where such evidence came from and whether it would survive parliamentary scrutiny. It would. Lucien smiled, and it was the expression that preceded executions. Because my evidence walks and talks and carries scars from 2 decades of hell, courtesy of the Harcourt family's hospitality. Harwick went very still. Your grace, what have you found? Justice. The word came out cold. And revenge, which in this case happened to be the same thing. Lucien moved to his desk, his mind already building the strategy. The Winter Assembly. Public venue. Every noble house in attendance. We expose the Harcourts there in front of their peers with proof they can't refute. That's extraordinarily dangerous. Moving against a family that powerful without guaranteed success could trigger political war. Then we guarantee success. Lucian's eyes held nothing but calculated fury. We build an ironclad case. We gather allies who will benefit from the Harcourt's fall. We engineer every detail until failure becomes impossible. And then we destroy them so thoroughly that their name becomes a warning about what happens when you betray the Mordain family. Who's the proof? Harwick asked quietly. Who did you find that can substantiate these claims? Lucian walked to the window, staring out at his duchy wrapped in snow and darkness. Someone I thought I'd lost forever. Someone whose return changes absolutely everything about the political landscape. Someone the Harcourts will try to kill the moment they learn he's alive. Your grace? Dismissed. Lucian didn't turn around. We'll speak more tomorrow when I've had time to plan the details. For now, just know that the engagement to Evelyn Harcourt is dead. And soon, so is her family's influence. Harwick left without another word. Alone, Lucian pressed his forehead against the cold glass and allowed himself exactly 60 seconds of something that wasn't iron control. 60 seconds to process that his father was alive. That 20 years of grief had been manufactured by enemies wearing friendly faces. That the marriage alliance he'd been pressured toward was actually a trap designed to complete what murder had started. 60 seconds to acknowledge that a woman with nothing but principles and a knife had somehow managed to crack armor he'd spent 2 decades forging. Then the 60 seconds ended. He straightened, his reflection in the glass showing the Duke of Ravenshire restored to full power. Emotionless. Calculating. Ready to burn down anyone who stood between him and justice. 3 weeks until the Winter Assembly. 3 weeks to build a case. Gather allies. Position every piece on the board exactly where it needed to be for checkmate. 3 weeks to figure out what to do about Seraphina Vale and the way she looked at him like she could see the human being buried beneath the Duke. The storm outside intensified. Wind howling through Ravenshire's towers like the kingdom itself was screaming warnings about what came next. Lucien smiled into the darkness. Let it scream. Let England tremble. Let the Harcourt family spend their final days in ignorance while he constructed the gallows they'd hang from. Because the Iron Duke had just learned that mercy wasn't weakness after all. It was a weapon. And he was about to teach his enemies exactly what happened when you mistook his father's kindness for vulnerability worth exploiting. The reckoning was coming, and this time, there would be no survivors. 3 days passed like stones dropping into dark water, each one sinking deeper into currents Lucian couldn't see but felt pulling at everything he'd built. The castle moved around him with its usual rhythms, servants attending their duties, guards changing shifts, the machinery of power grinding forward, because that's what machinery did when nobody told it to stop. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. Something fundamental had cracked in the foundation, and Lucien felt it every time he walked past his father's sealed chambers or caught himself thinking about a woman who should have meant nothing beyond a tactical problem requiring solution. The planning consumed him. Hours spent in the study with maps and ledgers spread across every surface, building the case against the Harcourts piece by careful piece. Financial records showing irregular payments, witness statements from servants who'd seen things they shouldn't have. The network of conspiracy spreading like rot through England's nobility, all of it connecting back to one family's ambition and their willingness to murder for advancement. Cedric recovered slowly, his body healing faster than whatever damage 20 years of captivity and survival had carved into his soul. Dr. Winters reported steady progress while asking no questions, which was exactly this kind of loyalty Lucien valued. The physician understood that curiosity killed more than cats in Ravenshire Castle. Serafina remained locked in her gilded cage, and Lucien pretended he didn't find excuses to walk past her door more often than tactical necessity demanded. On the fourth morning, Lord Harwick arrived at the study with an expression that made Lucien's instincts sharpen like blades, sensing incoming threat. "Your Grace, we have a problem." Lucien didn't look up from the documents he was reviewing. Define problem. Lady Evelyn Harcourt is requesting an immediate private audience. She's in the entrance hall now, refusing to leave until you see her. Tell her I'm occupied. I did. Harwick's tone carried the weight of bad news getting worse. She says she has information about threats against your life. Says it's urgent enough that protocol doesn't matter. Lucien's pen stopped moving. He looked up slowly, reading the advisor's face for signs of deception or manipulation. Found nothing but genuine concern mixed with the political instinct that had kept Harwick alive through 4 decades of noble intrigue. How long has she been here? 30 minutes, making quite the scene. Half the castle staff has seen her, which means half of Ravenshire will hear about it by nightfall. Perfect. Lucien set down the pen with deliberate care. Nothing says innocent like demanding emergency meetings. It's almost like someone wants to appear concerned about my welfare while positioning themselves as my savior. You think it's a setup? I think the Harcourts don't make moves without calculating 3 steps ahead. Lucien stood, adjusting his coat with movements that looked casual, but were actually checking the knife he kept sheathed against his ribs. But we don't gain information by hiding. Show her to the blue receiving room. I'll hear what she has to say. Your Grace, if this is a trap, then it's a trap I'm walking into with my eyes open. Lucien moved toward the door. Alert Captain Thorne. I want guards positioned but not visible. And Harwick, if anything happens to me in that room, my father knows everything. The information gets released regardless. Make sure that message reaches the right ears. The advisor's eyes widened fractionally. Your father is alive and currently residing in the East Wing. Lucien smiled at Harwick's shock. Surprise, and now you understand why the Harcourts are getting desperate. They thought they buried their mistake 20 years ago. Turns out they just delayed the reckoning. He left Harwick standing frozen and descended to the receiving room where England's nobility came to beg favors and make promises they rarely kept. The blue room earned its name from walls covered in silk the color of deep water, the kind that drowned men who misjudged its depth. Evelyn stood by the window, her posture perfect, her dress expensive enough to feed a village for a month. She turned when he entered, and Lucien saw real fear in her eyes. Not the practiced concern of a politician's daughter, but genuine terror barely controlled beneath aristocratic composure. Your Grace. Her voice trembled despite obvious effort to steady it. Thank you for seeing me. You demanded to see me. Lucien closed the door but didn't move closer. There's a difference between gratitude and getting what you forced. Now explain why you're in my castle making threats about my life before I have you removed. Because they're planning to kill you. The words tumbled out too fast, too raw to be rehearsed. At the Winter Assembly. My father and his allies. They're going to stage an accident during the opening ceremony and blame it on political rivals. They think if you're dead, Parliament will hand Ravenshire to whoever offers the best stability, and we're positioned to be that offer. Lucien studied her without expression. Why tell me? Why betray your own family? Because I'm not a murderer. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. Because this has gone too far. I knew about the political maneuvering, the arranged marriage, all the normal nobility games. But assassination? That crosses lines even I won't follow. How convenient. Lucien's voice dropped to something dangerous. Your family spends 20 years building toward control of my duchy. And now, 3 weeks before their endgame, you develop a conscience. Forgive me if I don't immediately trust your sudden moral awakening. I don't care if you trust me. Evelyn stepped forward, her fear shifting to something harder. I care that you're alive to stop them. Because if you die and they take Ravenshire, I become the Duchess of a territory built on murder, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I could have prevented it. Who else knows about the assassination plan? My father, 3 of his closest allies in Parliament, and someone inside your own household feeding them information about your movements and security. Lucien's blood went cold. Say that again. There's a spy in Ravenshire Castle. Evelyn's eyes held his. Someone close enough to your operations that they know your schedule, your routines, your vulnerabilities. My father wouldn't plan something this big without inside intelligence, which means someone you trust is selling you out.
The world tilted sideways for exactly 3 seconds before Lucien's training locked everything down. His face showed nothing. His voice emerged steady. Names. I don't know. That information stays with my father. But, Your Grace. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the desperation in her eyes. Whoever it is has been feeding information for months. Maybe longer. Everything you've been planning, every move you've made, they know about it. Lucien's mind raced through his inner circle. Harwick, Thorne, Dr. Winters. The handful of servants with access to his private areas. His father, newly returned and carrying 20 years of potential resentment. Even Serafina, street smart and perfectly positioned to observe everything while pretending to be a prisoner. Trust was a luxury he'd never allowed himself. Now it looked like wisdom. What do you want in exchange for this information? Because nobody gives away intelligence that could destroy their family without expecting something in return. Evelyn's laugh was bitter. I want out. I want the engagement officially ended so my father can't use me as his chess piece anymore. I want protection when this blows up. Because the moment he realizes I warned you, I'm dead. And I want your word that when you destroy the Harcourt family, and we both know you will, you'll remember that I tried to stop the worst of it. Done. The agreement came too easily, and they both knew it. Lucien had no intention of keeping promises made under duress, but she'd given him valuable information, and that bought her a few more days of life. Now get out of my castle before someone sees you here too long and starts asking questions I don't want to answer yet. Evelyn moved toward the door, then stopped. Your Grace, one more thing. Whatever you're planning for the winter assembly, whatever evidence you think you have against my family, they know about it. The spies already told them. You're walking into a trap thinking you're springing one. Then I'll spring it better. Lucien's smile was all teeth. I've been planning traps since before you learned to curtsy, Lady Harcourt. Your family's mistake was thinking they were the only ones playing the long game. She left without another word. Lucien stood in the blue room listening to her footsteps fade, his mind processing implications like poison spreading through blood. A spy in his household. The assassination plot. Evelyn's convenient conscience. Every piece of information felt simultaneously true and false, real threats wrapped in potential misdirection. He walked to his study and found Harwick exactly where he'd left him, the old advisor's face still showing shock from the revelation about Cedric. Lock down the castle. Lucien's voice cut through the silence. Nobody in or out without my personal authorization. Double the guards on my father's chambers and on Miss Vale's room. And Harwick, I need you to compile a list of everyone with access to my private papers, my schedule, and my strategic planning over the last 6 months. Your Grace, what's happened? Either I've just been warned about a real threat, or someone's playing games sophisticated enough that I can't tell the difference yet. Lucien moved to the window overlooking Ravenshire. Either way, we assume everyone's compromised until proven otherwise. Everyone? Everyone. Lucien turned to face him. Including you. Harwick's face went carefully blank. I've served your family for 40 years. Which makes you either the most loyal retainer in England or the perfect long-term plant. Lucien watched for reactions. Don't take it personally. I'm currently suspicious of my own shadow. That's what happens when you learn someone close enough to touch has been feeding your enemy's information for months. The advisor absorbed this like a man taking a punch. What do you need from me? That list. Within the hour. And Harwick, if you are the spy, now would be an excellent time to confess. I'm in a merciful mood, which means I'll only have you hanged instead of doing something creative with hot iron and your internal organs. I'm not the spy, Your Grace. Harwick's voice carried the weight of truth. But then again, good liars always sounded truthful. I'll bring you the list. He left, and Lucien was alone with thoughts that circled like wolves around wounded prey. A spy. Inside his household. Close enough to know details, trusted enough to access information that should have been locked behind layers of security. He made his way to Cedric's chambers, dismissing the guards with a gesture that brooked no argument. Inside, his father sat by the window, reading one of the philosophy texts he'd left behind 20 years ago, looking almost exactly like he had in Lucien's childhood memories, except for the scars and the shadows that live behind his eyes now. We need to talk. Lucien closed the door. And I need you to be completely honest, because if you lie to me right now, I will treat you exactly like I'd treat any other enemy. Cedric set down the book slowly. That's quite the opening. What's happened? Someone's been feeding the Harcourts information from inside this castle. Lucien leaned against the door, his body blocking the exit. Someone with access to my planning, my movements, my strategies. Someone I trust enough to let them get close. And you think it's me? Not a question. I think you're a man who spent 20 years in hell watching his son become someone you don't recognize. I think resentment is a powerful motivator. I think you have every reason to want revenge against the family that destroyed your life, and betraying me to them would be a good way to achieve that. Cedric's laugh was harsh. You really have lost faith in everything, haven't you? Including the man who raised you. Faith gets men killed. Lucien's voice stayed flat. Proof keeps them alive. So prove you're not the spy. How exactly do I prove a negative? Cedric stood, moving with stiffness that came from wounds still healing. I can't prove I haven't been doing something. That's not how evidence works. Then tell me who has. Because someone in this castle is selling me out, and you're the convenient new variable in an equation that was balanced before you arrived. They stared at each other across the room, father and son separated by 20 years of divergent survival and the fundamental inability to trust anymore. I'm not your enemy, Lucien. Cedric's voice gentled. I know I've given you reasons to doubt everything, including me, but I didn't survive 2 decades of captivity and 18 years of hiding just to betray you to the people who destroyed our family. Then help me figure out who did. Lucien pushed off the door, because if we can't identify the spy before the Winter Assembly, everything we're planning falls apart. The Harcourts will be ready for every move. They'll turn our attack into our execution. What do you need? I need you to think like a predator. Cedric had always been too merciful for Lucien's taste, but he'd survived impossible situations, which meant he understood strategy even if he didn't have the stomach for brutal implementation. Who would you compromise if you wanted to destroy me from the inside? Cedric moved to the desk, his mind clearly engaging with the problem. Someone with access but not enough authority to draw suspicion. Someone you interact with regularly but don't consider irreplaceable. Someone whose loyalty you've never questioned because they've been part of the landscape for so long, you stopped seeing them as a potential threat. That describes half the castle staff. Then narrow it down. Who knows about the Winter Assembly plans? Who knows I have evidence against the Harcourts? Who knows you're alive? The list contracted sharply. Harwick, Thorne, Dr. Winters, and Miss Vale. Cedric finished the thought. The woman who supposedly saved my life but conveniently inserted herself into the exact center of your operations at the exact moment when having an inside observer would be most valuable to your enemies. Lucien's jaw clenched. She pulled a knife on me. She defied me. She showed nothing but contempt for authority and power. Perfect cover. Cedric's eyes were sharp despite his physical weakness. What better way to appear non-threatening than by seeming to challenge you? You respect defiance because it's rare. You notice it. You pay attention to it, which means you bring the defiant ones closer instead of pushing them away. She saved your life. Maybe. Or maybe she found a dying man, realized the opportunity he represented, and played her part perfectly. Cedric moved closer. Son, I want to be wrong about this, but you taught me something these past few days through your actions. You taught me that survival requires suspecting everyone, including the people who seem most trustworthy. Lucien felt something cold settle in his chest. The possibility that Serafina was playing him, that her defiance and principles and the way she looked at him like she could see his humanity were all carefully constructed tools. It made tactical sense in a way that terrified him. Because if she was the spy, it meant he'd let desire cloud judgment.
It meant weakness had crept in through gaps he didn't know his armor had developed. It meant every moment he'd spent thinking about her instead of treating her like the threat she potentially represented was proof that he'd become exactly what his father had been. Soft. I'll handle it. Lucien's voice came out empty. If she's the spy, she dies. If she's innocent, she stays locked up until this is over. Either way, the problem gets contained. What about the others? Harwick, Thorn, the doctor. I'll deal with each of them. Lucien moved toward the door. Starting now. Wait! Cedric's voice stopped him. If you're wrong about this, if you start executing loyal people because you've lost the ability to distinguish betrayal from dedication, you'll destroy yourself faster than any enemy could. Then I'd better not be wrong. Lucien opened the door. Because I've spent 20 years building a rule based on the certainty that everyone would betray me if given sufficient motivation. It would be almost comforting to learn I was right all along. He walked through corridors that suddenly felt like enemy territory, every servant a potential threat, every guard possibly compromised. The paranoia he'd carefully cultivated as a tool was eating him alive now, turning protection into poison. He found Captain Thorn in the barracks reviewing supply requisitions, the kind of mundane work that made Lucien's life possible without anyone noticing. Captain. A word. Thorn stood immediately, snapping to attention with military precision. Your Grace, how long have you served Ravenshire? 15 years, Your Grace. Since you were 20 and needed someone to rebuild the guard after your predecessor's incompetence got half of them killed. 15 years of loyalty. 15 years of perfect service. Lucien studied the man who'd been at his side through a dozen political crises and twice that many genuine threats. Or 15 years of perfect positioning, building trust until the moment came to cash it in for maximum damage. If someone offered you enough money to betray me, would you take it? Thorn's face showed genuine offense. No, Your Grace. Never. Not even if your family was threatened. Not even if the price was high enough to secure their futures for generations. My loyalty isn't for sale. The captain's voice carried iron certainty. I've bled for Ravenshire, killed for it, lost men under my command defending it. I wouldn't betray that for any price. Everyone has a price. Lucien moved closer. Everyone has a line where principle becomes less important than survival. I need to know if you've reached yours. I haven't. Thorn met his eyes without flinching. And with respect, Your Grace, if you have to ask, then you've already lost the ability to trust anyone. Which means whoever's trying to destroy you has already won. The words hit like arrows, finding gaps in armor. Lucien dismissed him and moved through the castle like a ghost haunting his own domain. He interrogated Dr. Winters, who responded with clinical calm, questioned senior servants who'd been with the family for decades. Each conversation the same pattern, protestations of loyalty, offense at being suspected, the slow erosion of relationships he'd never realized mattered until he was destroying them. By evening, he'd learned nothing except that paranoia was a hammer that turned every person into a nail. He found himself outside Serafina's door without consciously deciding to go there. The guards straightened when he approached. Leave us. They obeyed without question, which was either a sign of good discipline or proof they were compromised. At this point, Lucien couldn't tell the difference anymore. He unlocked the door. Serafina sat by the window reading, and the scene was so domestically normal that it felt like mockery. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. Let me guess. She set down the book. You've come to interrogate me about being a spy. Or maybe just kill me preemptively. Save yourself the trouble of an investigation. How did you know? Lucien closed the door behind him. Because I've been locked in this room for 4 days with nothing to do but think. And I know how men like you operate. Someone whispers danger. You lash out at everyone within reach. She stood, facing him without fear. So go ahead, ask your questions. Threaten me. Do whatever you need to do to feel in control again. Someone's been feeding the Harcourts information from inside this castle. Lucien's voice came out colder than he intended. Someone who knows things they shouldn't. Someone with access to planning they had no business seeing. And you think it's me? Serafina laughed, but there was no humor in it. The street rat you dragged here against her will. The woman who's been imprisoned for helping your father. Yes, that makes perfect sense. I'm clearly running a sophisticated spy operation from my locked room. You saved my father. Awfully convenient timing. Found him right when he'd be most useful. Brought him to my attention right when the Harcourts needed inside intelligence. Or I saved a dying man because I'm not a monster. Her voice rose. Not everything is a conspiracy. Not everyone is playing games. Some people actually do the right thing because it's right, not because it serves some hidden agenda. In my experience, those people end up dead. Lucian moved closer. The right thing gets you killed when you're surrounded by predators, which means anyone who claims to operate on pure principle is either lying or too stupid to survive long term. You don't strike me as stupid, and you don't strike me as someone who's completely lost his humanity. Seraphina stood her ground. But here we are. You're accusing me of betrayal, and I'm defending myself to a man who wouldn't recognize loyalty if it saved his life. Which, incidentally, I did when I protected your father. You protected a valuable asset. Lucian's jaw clenched. You saw an opportunity and took it. I'd respect the play if you just admit it instead of hiding behind righteous indignation. The slap came so fast he almost didn't block it. Almost. His hand caught her wrist an inch from his face, his grip iron tight. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Lucian saw something that made his entire theory collapse. Not calculation, not the careful mask of a trained operative, just raw fury and hurt pride and the desperate exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too long without support. You want to know why I saved your father? Her voice shook. Because I've watched people die on these streets my entire life. Watched the cold take them. Watched hunger break them. Watched men like you ride past like they were obstacles instead of human beings. And I got tired of it. Tired of a world where power means you get to decide who lives and who dies based on convenience. So when I found someone dying, I helped. Not for politics, not for advantage, because I was tired of being the kind of person who walks away. Lucian's grip loosened fractionally. If you're lying, then you'll kill me. I know. She pulled her wrist free. But before you do, ask yourself something. Ask yourself, when was the last time someone in your life didn't want something from you? When was the last time someone helped you without calculating the return? When was the last time trust wasn't a transaction? He couldn't answer. That's what I thought. Seraphina turned back to the window. Now get out. Interrogate someone else. Destroy more relationships with your paranoia. Do whatever you need to do to feel safe in your fortress of suspicion. But don't expect me to be grateful for the privilege of being accused by the man whose father I saved. Lucian stood frozen, caught between tactical certainty and something that felt disturbingly like doubt. The sound of running footsteps broke the moment. Thorne burst through the door, his face carrying news that made Lucien's blood turn to ice. Your Grace, your father, he's gone. The world tilted sideways, gone. The East Wing chambers are empty. No sign of struggle. No sign of forced entry. Thorne's breathing was ragged from running. He just vanished. And your Grace, there's blood. Not much, but enough to suggest he left injured or was taken against his will. Lucien was moving before conscious thought caught up. Seraphina forgotten, accusations abandoned, everything narrowing to single-point focus. The corridor blurred past, guards scattered from his path. He hit the East Wing at a dead run and found the door to Cedric's chambers standing open like a mouth-screaming silence. Inside, everything looked exactly as it should. Books on the desk, fire burning low in the hearth. But the bed was empty, and near the window, a small pool of blood stained the floor, dark as accusations. Secure the gates! Lucian's voice came out deadly calm. Nobody leaves Ravenshire Castle. I want every room searched, every corridor blocked, every possible exit covered. If my father is still inside these walls, I want him found. If someone took him, I want them caught before they reach the city. Guards flooded the wing like military invasion. Lucien knelt beside the blood, his fingers touching the still wet surface. Fresh. Minutes old. Which meant whoever took Cedric or whoever helped him leave was still close, still within reach. Your Grace. Harwick appeared in the doorway. I found this on the desk. He held out a piece of paper covered in handwriting Lucien recognized immediately. His father's distinctive script, the same flowing letters that had signed birthday cards and official documents before death, supposedly ended the need for either. The message was simple. Forgive me. I thought I could protect you by staying hidden. I was wrong. They know I'm alive and they're coming for both of us. Better I face them alone than let you die defending a ghost. Trust no one, especially those who claim to have your best interests at heart. Your loving father. Lucien read it twice, his mind refusing to process the implications. Cedric had left willingly. walked out of Ravenshire Castle into the night, leaving behind the son he'd finally reconnected with, choosing sacrifice over safety. Or this was exactly what a spy would want him to believe while they delivered his father straight to the Harcourts and collected whatever fortune had been promised for the delivery. He stood slowly, the note crumpling in his fist. Behind him, Seraphina's voice cut through the chaos. "I told you, not everyone is lying. Sometimes people just do what they think is right, even when it destroys them." Lucian turned to face her, seeing his own anguish reflected in eyes that held no victory, no vindication, just sadness for a man who'd lost the ability to accept that not every gesture came wrapped in betrayal. Find him. The order came out raw. Search every street, check every building, use every contact, every informant, every spy we have. I want my father found before the Harcourts get their hands on him. And if anyone gets in the way, remove them, permanently. The castle erupted into orchestrated chaos, guards and servants mobilizing with military precision. Lucien stood in his father's empty chambers, surrounded by books on mercy and philosophy, and all the principles Cedric had believed in strongly enough to nearly get himself killed. Stood there with blood on his fingers and crumpled goodbye in his hand, and the sudden terrible certainty that everything he'd built to protect himself had actually just ensured he'd destroy everyone he cared about, because Cedric was gone. And Lucien had no idea if his father left to protect him, or if the spy he'd been hunting had been working under his nose the entire time, wearing the face of the one person he'd thought was safely dead. The answer would determine everything: who lived, who died, whether the Iron Duke could be reforged, or if he'd finally shattered into pieces too broken to repair. Outside, the storm that had been building for days finally broke. Rain hammering against stone like heaven itself was weeping for the choices men made when fear ruled stronger than love. The rain turned Ravenshire into a nightmare painted in water and shadow. Every street a river trying to wash away the sins accumulated over 3 centuries of Mordain rule. Lucien stood in the castle courtyard while his guards mobilized around him, their movements efficient despite the chaos. Because efficiency was what separated soldiers from corpses when the world started burning. His coat was already soaked through. Rain ran down his face like tears he'd never allow himself to shed. And somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, his father was either running toward death or being delivered to it by hands Lucien should have seen coming. The failure ate at him worse than any physical wound could manage. He'd spent 20 years building armor against exactly this kind of pain, 20 years learning to anticipate betrayal before it arrived, and still someone had walked his father out of the safest fortress in England like stealing candy from children who didn't know better. "Your Grace." Thorne appeared through the rain, water streaming off his uniform. The City Watch reports movement near the docks. Someone matching Lord Cedric's description was seen entering a warehouse district 20 minutes ago. Could be a lead, could be misdirection. Could be the trap I've been too blind to see forming around me. Lucien swung into his saddle, the horse dancing beneath him, sensing the violence coiled in its rider's muscles. Assemble a strike team, light armor, heavy weapons. We move fast, and we move quiet. If the Harcourts have my father, I want him extracted before they realize we're coming. If this is misdirection, I want whoever set it up alive enough to answer questions before they die screaming. The captain hesitated exactly 1 second too long. "Say it." Lucien's voice cut through the rain like a blade. "Whatever you're thinking, say it now before we ride into whatever hell is waiting. Your Grace, if this is a trap designed specifically to draw you out, then it's working perfectly." Lucien's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Because I'm going anyway. My father survived 20 years of imprisonment and escape and hiding in shadows just to be taken from my own castle. I don't care if the entire Harcourt family is waiting with loaded cannons. I'm getting him back, even if it costs you everything you've built. Everything I built was supposed to prevent this exact situation." Lucien's hands tightened on the reins hard enough that leather creaked. "If it can't protect the one person who matters, then it's worthless anyway. Now move before I find someone with less tactical concern and more operational courage." Thorne moved. 20 riders assembled in formation that spoke to years of drilling for exactly this kind of emergency response. Men who'd bled for Ravenshire. Men who'd killed for it. Men who understood that the Duke's orders were absolute even when they led straight into obvious danger. They rode through the gates like vengeance made flesh, hooves striking cobblestones in rhythm that sounded like war drums announcing the end of mercy. The city unfolded before them in layers of misery barely contained by architecture. Rain turned every surface treacherous. Buildings leaned together like conspirators sharing secrets. Torchlight guttered in windows where people huddled against the storm and pretended they didn't hear horses thundering past on missions that would likely end in violence too public to ignore. Lucien's mind raced through scenarios while his body operated on pure trained instinct. If the Harcourts had Cedric, they'd use him as leverage, force concessions, demand the evidence be destroyed, maybe even push for the marriage alliance as the price of his father's life. Standard hostage negotiation tactics that assumed Lucien valued one life over strategic advantage. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was, because Lucien had spent 20 years proving that he'd burn down anything, including himself, before showing weakness. His father understood that better than anyone, which meant if Cedric really had left that note, if he'd really walked into danger voluntarily, it was because he knew his son well enough to know that Lucien would turn this hostage situation into a bloodbath rather than negotiate. The warehouse district materialized from rain and darkness like a graveyard built from commerce's corpse. Abandoned buildings stretched along the riverbank, their windows dark as dead eyes, their walls crumbling from neglect and the weight of economic shifts that had moved prosperity elsewhere. Perfect place for an ambush. Perfect place for a final confrontation. Perfect place to die if you miscalculated even slightly. Lucien raised his fist, halting the formation. Thorn moved his horse alongside. Your Grace. Third warehouse from the east, light showing through cracks in the walls. Fresh tracks in the mud leading to the entrance. Too obvious. Lucien studied the building with eyes that had learned to see traps before they closed. They want me to see those tracks. Want me to think my father's in there waiting for rescue. Want me to charge in like some protagonist from the kind of stories where honor matters more than survival. Then what's your play? We give them what they expect. Lucien's smile was cold calculation made visible, but not how they expect it. Thorn, take 15 men and surround the building. Cover every exit. Anyone tries to leave, you kill them unless they're my father. Understood. And you, Your Grace. I'm walking through the front door with 4 guards. Let them think I'm arrogant enough to believe I can handle whatever's waiting. Let them position for the ambush they've planned. And when they commit to it, you collapse the trap from outside. That's extraordinarily dangerous. That's why it might actually work. Lucien dismounted, his boots hitting mud with sounds like bodies hitting graves. They're expecting either full assault or cautious negotiation. We're giving them something in between. Aggressive enough to look like confidence, small enough to look like it can be overwhelmed. And the moment they try to spring whatever they've planned, they'll discover that confidence and stupidity aren't the same thing. The team split with military precision. Thorn took his contingent into the shadows, disappearing like ghosts with weapons. Lucien approached the warehouse with 4 of his best soldiers, men who'd proven themselves in situations where proving yourself meant staying alive when everyone around you died. The door stood slightly ajar. Inviting, obvious, exactly the kind of thing that got eager men killed. Lucien kicked it open and walked into hell, wearing the expression he'd perfected over 2 decades of making enemies regret their life choices. The interior was a study in controlled chaos, crates stacked to create corridors and kill zones, lanterns positioned to illuminate specific areas while leaving others in shadow. And in the center of the largest open space, tied to a chair and bleeding from multiple wounds, sat Lord Cedric Mordain looking like death had finally come to collect. But his eyes were alive, alert, and when they met Lucien's, they carried a warning that screamed trap louder than any spoken word could manage. Lucien's hand moved to his pistol without conscious thought. Welcome, Your Grace. The voice came from the shadows behind Cedric, cultured and smooth and carrying the kind of confidence that came from holding all the cards in a game you'd rigged from the start. Lord Edmund Harcourt stepped into the light, and behind him, a dozen armed men emerged from concealment with weapons trained on Lucien's position. So good of you to accept our invitation. We were concerned you might send soldiers instead of coming yourself. I don't send men to do what I can handle personally. Lucien's voice stayed level despite the pistols and rifles aimed at his chest. Delegation is for administrative tasks. Killing the people who kidnapped my father is personal entertainment. Such bravado. Edmund smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd won before the game even started. You know, I almost admire it. The way you've ruled through fear and brutality, turning Ravenshire into a fortress that even kings hesitate to challenge. Quite impressive for someone who inherited a duchy on the verge of collapse. Get to the point. I didn't ride through a storm to hear my accomplishments listed by a man whose family built their fortune on murder and manipulation. The point, dear Duke, is that your father's return presents certain complications. Edmund moved closer to Cedric, one hand resting almost gently on the older man's shoulder. You see, we spent considerable resources ensuring Lord Cedric stayed dead. His resurrection threatens to expose activities that are better left buried with the past. So we find ourselves requiring a solution. You want the evidence destroyed. Lucian's mind calculated angles even as he spoke, tracking guard positions, identifying cover, measuring the distance between himself and his father. You want assurance that what happened 20 years ago never becomes public knowledge, and you think holding my father hostage gives you leverage to make that happen. Perceptive. Edmund's smile widened. I can see why you've been such a formidable opponent. Yes, we want the evidence destroyed. All of it. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of proof you've compiled against my family. In exchange, your father lives. You get to continue ruling Ravenshire without the distraction of a political war you can't win. Everyone survives. Everyone profits. Quite civilized, really, except for the part where you murdered my father's men, imprisoned him for years, and have spent 2 decades positioning to steal everything he built. Lucien's voice dropped to something dangerous. That part seems less civilized and more like something that deserves consequences involving fire and screaming. Come now. Don't be dramatic. Edmund's hand tightened on Cedric's shoulder hard enough to make the older man wince. This is simply business. Your family has resources we want. We have the political connections to protect those resources from parliamentary interference. A marriage alliance would have been the elegant solution, but you seem disinclined toward elegance, so we'll settle for a simple transaction. Evidence for life. Make the smart choice, Your Grace. Lucien looked at his father, reading the message in those eyes that had taught him how to ride and shoot, and all the things that mattered before the world taught him that mercy got men killed. Cedric's expression said everything words couldn't, said, don't negotiate, said, don't give them anything, said, I'd rather die than watch you compromise everything you are to save me, said, I love you enough to accept the consequences of your refusal. And Lucien realized with perfect clarity that this was the moment he'd been building toward for 20 years, the choice between the man he'd become and the man his father had hoped he'd be, between strategic necessity and the kind of principle that got people killed but let them die, knowing they'd stood for something worth dying for. He'd spent 2 decades choosing survival over sentiment. Time to find out what happened when he chose differently. No. The word came out flat. Absolute. I'm not giving you the evidence. I'm not negotiating with terrorists who think kidnapping makes them clever. And I'm not letting you walk out of this warehouse alive regardless of what happens to my father. Edmund's smile vanished. You're willing to let him die rather than make a simple concession. I'm willing to let him die the way he would have wanted to. Lucian's hand moved to his pistol, slowly, deliberately, giving the guards time to track the movement and tense for whatever came next. On his terms, making a choice, standing for something, not on his knees begging men like you for mercy you'll never give anyway. Cedric's eyes closed, not in defeat, in something that looked disturbingly like peace. Your Grace, I'm giving you one final chance. Edmund's voice hardened. Agree to our terms, or watch your father bleed out on this floor while my men ensure you don't leave to tell anyone what happened here. Then you'd better make sure your men are good enough to stop me. Lucian's smile was all teeth. Because I'm about to demonstrate why the Iron Duke earned his reputation, and it wasn't through negotiation. He drew. The warehouse erupted into violence so fast that thought couldn't keep pace with action. Lucien's first shot took Edmund in the shoulder, spinning him away from Cedric. His guards opened fire simultaneously, their rifles creating a wall of sound that made ears bleed and turned air into flying lead. But Lucien was already moving, his body dropping into a roll that carried him behind a crate, while his soldiers returned fire with the kind of discipline that came from drilling until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Outside, Thorne's forces heard the gunfire and crashed through windows and side doors, collapsing the warehouse into a 3-dimensional battlefield where every shadow might hide either friend or enemy. Lucien came up firing, his pistol speaking the only language that mattered when words failed. 2 of Edmund's men went down, their blood painting crates the color of expensive wine. Return fire chewed through wood where Lucien had been standing half a second earlier. He moved on pure instinct now, the part of his brain that calculated odds and assessed risk, completely shut down in favor of the survival mechanisms that kept men alive when death pressed close enough to smell its breath. A guard rounded the corner too fast, his rifle rising. Lucien shot him through the chest before the barrel completed its arc. Another attacker from the left. Lucien's knife found his throat before he could cry warning. Third one from above, perched on crates like a sniper getting cocky. One of Lucien's soldiers took him down with a rifle shot that would have made marksmen weep with envy. Through the chaos, Lucien tracked his father. Cedric remained tied to the chair in the open, blood running from wounds that needed immediate treatment. Edmund had fallen back into deeper shadows, clutching his shoulder, shouting orders that his men tried to follow, even as Thorn's forces systematically destroyed their defensive positions. Lucien ran for his father. Bullets stitched the ground beside his boots, geysers of splinters erupting like wooden rain. He didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge the very real possibility that the next shot would find flesh instead of floorboards. He hit the chair hard, his momentum carrying both him and Cedric backward into cover behind a stack of crates that wouldn't stop rifle fire, but at least blocked line of sight. His hands worked the ropes with speed born from practice and panic combined. "Are you hit? Anywhere critical? Shoulder, ribs, maybe internal bleeding?" Cedric's voice was steady despite the damage. "But I've survived worse. Get yourself out of here. Let me be the distraction." "Shut up!" The ropes came free. Lucien pulled his father upright, supporting more weight than Cedric's frame should contain. "We're leaving together, or we're dying together. Your choice, but I'm done making decisions that prioritize strategy over the people I give a damn about." "When did you become sentimental?" "About 30 seconds ago, when I realized that dying for principle beats living as the kind of monster who'd negotiate with your kidnappers." Lucien hauled Cedric toward the nearest exit, his free hand still firing at anything that moved in peripheral vision. "Now, move faster before I regret this newfound character development." They made it 5 yards before Edmund's voice cut through the gunfire. "Stop, or I kill her." Lucien turned. Edmund stood 20 feet away, his wounded shoulder forgotten, his pistol pressed against Seraphina Vale's temple. She looked terrified and furious in equal measure, her hands bound, her dress torn, her eyes promising murder if she survived the next 60 seconds. "How?" The word came out strangled. Lucien had left her locked in the castle, guarded, secured behind walls that had withstood sieges. "You think you're the only one with inside intelligence?" Edmund's smile was blood-stained and triumphant. "We've had people in your household for months. Getting one woman out of her room was barely an inconvenience. And now she's leverage you can't ignore, because despite all your brutality and iron control, you've developed feelings for the street rat who saved your father." "I barely know her." Lucien's voice stayed flat, but his hands had started shaking, and that told the truth his words tried to hide. Then walking away should be easy. Edmund pressed the pistol harder against Seraphina's head. "Leave her. Take your father. Run. I'll even give you a 30-second head start before my remaining men hunt you down." Very generous, considering you just killed 8 of them. Seraphina's eyes met Lucien's across the warehouse, and in that moment, he saw everything he'd been trying to deny for 4 days. Saw the woman who'd defied him to protect a stranger. Saw the strength that came from choosing right over easy, even when easy would have kept her alive. Saw what he could have been if he hadn't spent 20 years killing every soft part of himself in pursuit of invulnerability. Saw what he was about to lose if he kept choosing survival over humanity. "Don't." Seraphina's voice came out steady. "Don't you dare give them anything for me. I knew the risks. I chose this. Now you make the smart choice and walk away." "The smart choice got me here." Lucien's hand stopped shaking as certainty settled like armor over fear. "The smart choice turned me into someone who couldn't recognize loyalty when it saved my father's life. The smart choice built a fortress so strong that nothing good could get in and nothing human could get out. I'm done with smart choices." He lowered his pistol. Edmund's eyes widened fractionally. "You're surrendering. I'm adapting." Lucien took one step forward, hands visible, posture non-threatening. "You want the evidence destroyed. You want assurance that your family's crimes stay buried. You want to walk out of here alive. I can give you all of that. Just let her go." "Your Grace, no." Thorn's voice carried from somewhere in the shadows. "Don't do this." "Stand down, Captain." Lucien never took his eyes off Edmund. "This is my choice. Mine alone. and I'm choosing to prove that the Iron Duke learned something his father tried to teach him before politics and murder made the lesson impossible, which is that some things are worth dying for. And people who matter are worth more than power that cost you everything human. Edmund's pistol wavered slightly. You'll give me the evidence. All of it. Documented proof that my family is untouchable. Everything. Lucian took another step. Every ledger, every witness statement, every piece of proof. You'll walk out of here free to continue your political games without interference from me. Just let her go and this ends. Lucien, Cedric's voice carried warning. Think about what you're offering. I have. For the first time in 20 years, I'm thinking about what matters instead of what wins. Lucian smiled at his father. You were right all along. Mercy isn't weakness. Principle isn't suicide. And ruling through fear only works until you encounter something that makes fear irrelevant. What could possibly make fear irrelevant? Edmund sounded genuinely curious. Love. The word came out easier than Lucian expected. Turns out when you actually care about someone, the calculus changes. Death stops being the worst outcome. Losing them while staying safe becomes the thing you can't survive. How touching. Edmund's smile returned. Almost makes me regret what happens next. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse like the end of worlds. But Serafina was already moving, her bound hands somehow finding leverage, her body twisting away from the pistol's trajectory. The bullet missed her skull by inches, close enough to draw blood from her temple, far enough to leave her alive and furious. Lucien moved on instinct that transcended conscious thought. His knife left his hand in a throw that would have failed 9 times out of 10, but succeeded this once when it mattered most. The blade buried itself in Edmund's forearm, forcing his hand open, the pistol clattering to the floor. Serafina drove her elbow backward into Edmund's ribs with enough force to crack bone, and Lucien crossed the 20 feet between them like distance was negotiable while time held its breath. He hit Edmund with the full force of 20 years of controlled rage, finally finding a target that deserved every ounce of brutality he'd been cultivating. They went down together, impacting crates that shattered under combined weight. Lucien's fists found Edmund's face with mechanical precision, each strike carrying the weight of his father's imprisonment, of 20 years believing in death that was actually kidnapping, of a woman nearly murdered because she'd chosen principle over safety. Hands pulled him back before he could finish it. Thorn and 2 soldiers dragging him off Edmund's unconscious body while he still had enough control left to be pulled. Your Grace, enough. The captain's voice cut through red haze. He's down. You've won. Lucian's chest heaved, his hands bloody, his mind slowly returning from the place where violence lived separate from consequence. Around him, the warehouse had gone quiet. Edmund's remaining men either dead or surrendering, Thorn's forces securing the perimeter, and in the center of it all, Serafina sat against a crate with blood running down her temple, looking at Lucian like she was trying to figure out whether she'd just been saved or condemned. He moved to her on legs that felt like someone else's limbs attached to his body, knelt beside her. His hands shook again as he untied the ropes binding her wrists. You were supposed to stay in the castle. His voice came out rough. Safe. Protected. I was kidnapped by your household spy. Serafina's laugh held no humor. Turns out Dr. Winters has been feeding the Harcourt's information since before your father even returned. They grabbed me 3 hours ago, used me as insurance in case their leverage play with Cedric didn't work. Winters. Lucian's jaw clenched. The man who'd treated his childhood illnesses, who'd served his family for 30 years, who'd seemed completely above suspicion because loyalty that deep didn't turn. Everyone has a price. Serafina's eyes held his. Even the ones you'd bet your life wouldn't. That's what you told me, remember? I remember. Lucian's hands framed her face, his thumbs gentle against skin marked by violence he'd failed to prevent. I also remember thinking I was protecting you by keeping you locked up. Turned out I was just making you an easier target. So what now? Her question held weight beyond the current situation. What happens when the Iron Duke discovers that caring about people makes them vulnerable instead of keeping them safe? Now I figure out how to care about people while still being dangerous enough that enemies think twice before testing me. Lucian's smile was tired. Might take a while. 20 years of habits don't change overnight. Lucky for you, I've got time. Serafina's hand covered his. Assuming you're not planning to lock me up again for my own protection. Never again. The promise came easier than expected. From now on, You make your own choices about risk. I'll just make sure anyone who threatens you regrets it thoroughly before they die. Most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. You need to meet better people. They sat there while chaos organized itself around them. Two people who shouldn't have mattered to each other, finding that sometimes the universe didn't care about should and delivered connection anyway. Thorn approached, his face carefully neutral. Your Grace, the prisoners are secured. Edmund Harcourt is unconscious but alive. Dr. Winters was found attempting to flee through the east exit. He's also secured. And we recovered documents from Edmund's coat detailing the entire conspiracy, including names of every parliamentary ally involved. Lucien stood slowly, pulling Serafina up with him. Good. Lock them in the castle dungeons, under guard. Nobody sees them, nobody speaks to them until I decide what happens next. And the Winter Assembly. It's in 2 days. Every major house will be there expecting your engagement announcement. They'll get an announcement. Lucian's smile was cold calculation returning to familiar territory. Just not the one they're expecting. Thorn, send word to Lord Harwick. Tell him to prepare the evidence for public presentation. Every document, every witness, every piece of proof we've compiled. We're going to give England's nobility a show they'll remember for generations. Your Grace, that will trigger political war. Parliament will bow or break. Lucian's voice carried absolute certainty. Because I'm done playing their games by their rules. The Harcourts wanted Ravenshire. They'll get it. They'll get to see exactly what happens when you push the Iron Duke past the point where caution matters more than justice. Cedric limped over, supported by 2 soldiers, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes sharp. Son, what you did tonight was stupid, reckless, tactically unsound. Lucien met his father's gaze. Everything you would have done in my position. Exactly. Cedric's smile carried pride that hurt more than any wound. Welcome back. I've missed the man you were before you had to become what survival demanded. I'm not that man anymore, can't be. Too much has changed. Lucian's hand found Serafina's without conscious thought. But maybe I can be something in between. Something that remembers mercy while still being dangerous enough to protect the people who matter. That's all anyone can ask. Cedric's hand gripped his son's shoulder. Now let's get out of this warehouse before it collapses. And then you can explain your plan for the Winter Assembly, because I know that look. That's your I'm about to do something spectacular look. They walked out together into rain that had gentled to something almost peaceful. Behind them, the warehouse stood as testament to the night violence met principle, and somehow both survived. Ahead, Ravenshire waited, its towers barely visible through clouds and darkness. And 2 days beyond that, the Winter Assembly loomed like the edge of a cliff that Lucian intended to drive his enemies over, while England's. Nobility watched and learned what happened when you mistook his father's kindness for weakness worth exploiting. The game was about to end, and the Iron Duke had just changed all the rules. The 2 days before the Winter Assembly moved like water flowing toward a cliff, inevitable and cold and carrying everything in its path toward the moment when gravity would take over and pull the world down. Lucian spent them in his studies surrounded by evidence that would destroy families, ruin political careers, and reshape England's power structure in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The documents spread across his desk told a story 20 years in the making, each ledger and witness statement another nail in the coffin he was building for the Harcourt family and everyone who'd helped them. But the documents weren't what occupied his thoughts during the quiet hours when even revenge took a breath. He found himself thinking about his father, recuperating in the East Wing with wounds that would heal, but scars that would last forever. Thinking about Serafina, who'd refused to leave the castle despite being told she was free to go, who instead spent her time in the library reading books on governance and philosophy, like she was preparing for something neither of them had named yet. Thinking about the man he'd been before the warehouse, before the choice between smart and right had stopped being theoretical and started costing him sleep. You're brooding again. Cedric's voice came from the doorway, his father leaning against the frame because standing straight still hurt. I recognize the posture. Used to do it myself before I learned that overthinking is just another word for cowardice. I'm planning. Lucien didn't look up from the documents. There's a difference. Is there? Cedric moved into the room with careful steps that spoke to ribs still knitting. Because from here it looks like you're trying to calculate your way out of feeling something. Very familiar pattern. Very ineffective long-term strategy. You survived 20 years on strategy. Lucien finally met his father's eyes. Don't lecture me about ineffective when you're living proof it works. I survived on luck and stubbornness and the kind of desperate hope that keeps men breathing when breathing should have stopped. Cedric eased himself into the chair across the desk. Strategy had nothing to do with it. Strategy would have told me to give up. Accept death. Stop fighting against odds no rational person would challenge. But you didn't. No. Because I had something worth surviving for. Cedric's eyes held memories that still drew blood. I had a son who I needed to see again. Needed to know he'd become the kind of man who could protect himself from predators wearing friendly faces. And now I have seen it, and I can tell you that the man you became is extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. But he's also losing pieces of himself that he'll need if he wants to be more than just a very efficient monster. The words should have stung. Instead, they settled like truth finally spoken after years of careful avoidance. What pieces? Lucian's voice came out quieter than intended. The ones that let you sleep at night. The ones that let you trust someone without calculating betrayal probability. The ones that remember mercy isn't weakness and love isn't tactical liability. Cedric leaned forward despite the pain it caused. You've spent 20 years building armor so thick that nothing could hurt you. And you succeeded. But armor that keeps pain out also keeps everything else out. Joy. Connection. The possibility that not everyone is an enemy waiting for their moment. I've had this conversation with Serafina already. Lucien's hands moved papers around without actually accomplishing anything. She thinks I'm too damaged to remember how to be human. She thinks you're choosing damage over healing because it's familiar. Cedric's smile was gentle. And she's right. Familiar feels safer even when it's destroying you. Change is terrifying even when staying the same is killing you slower. Lucien stood, moving to the window that overlooked Ravenshire spread beneath his castle like a kingdom built on frozen ground. The city looked peaceful in morning light, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving through streets on errands that mattered to them even if they meant nothing in the grand scheme of power politics. What if I can't change? The admission cost more than he expected. What if 20 years was too long? What if I broke something in myself that can't be fixed? Then you'll die alone in a fortress full of people who fear you, but nobody who knows you. Cedric's voice carried no judgment, just observation earned through personal experience. That's the price you pay for choosing safety over risk. You survive everything except the loneliness of survival. The silence stretched between them, father and son separated by years and philosophy, but connected by blood that demanded honesty even when honesty hurt. Tell me about the winter assembly plan. Cedric changed subjects with the grace of someone who knew when to push and when to let truth settle. What exactly are you planning to do in front of England's entire nobility? Lucien turned from the window. Destroy the Harcourts. Expose the conspiracy. Show Parliament what happens when they think they can manipulate Ravenshire through marriage alliances and manufactured political pressure. Standard revenge theater with excellent supporting documentation. And after? What happens after you've burned down your enemies and reshaped the political landscape? I haven't thought that far ahead. Liar. Cedric's eyes were sharp. You've thought 15 moves ahead since you were 10 years old. So what happens after? When the smoke clears and you're standing on top of rubble, wondering why victory feels hollow. Lucien's jaw clenched. I rebuild. Consolidate power. Make sure everyone understands that challenging the Mordain family comes with consequences that last generations. That's what you think you should say. What do you actually want? The question hung in the air like smoke that couldn't be waved away. I want. Lucien stopped, started again. I want to stop calculating the betrayal probability of everyone I meet. I want to wake up without immediately assessing threats. I want to look at Serafina without wondering if she's playing some long game I haven't identified yet. I want to be the kind of man you were before they destroyed you. But I don't know how to get there from here. You start. Cedric stood slowly, crossing to his son. You start by making one choice that prioritizes connection over control. Then another. Then 1,000 more until the pattern shifts and suddenly you're someone who can accept love without treating it like a tactical weakness. Love. Lucien's laugh was bitter. I wouldn't know it if it walked up and introduced itself. Yes, you would. You felt it in that warehouse when you chose Serafina's life over strategic advantage. You felt it when you refused to negotiate with her kidnappers, even though negotiation was the smart play. Cedric's hand gripped Lucien's shoulder. Love is just another word for what you're willing to die protecting. You've known it your whole life. You've just been calling it duty, and pretending that made it less dangerous. The Winter Assembly began at sunset with all the pageantry England's nobility could muster when they wanted to remind each other that breeding and bloodlines still mattered in a world increasingly controlled by money and industrial power. Crystal chandeliers caught candlelight and threw it back in patterns that turned the grand hall into something from fairy tales people told children before reality taught them better. Banners hung from vaulted ceilings showing the crests of families who'd ruled since before England was called England, back when power meant castles and armies instead of parliamentary votes and trade agreements. Lucien stood in the anteroom dressed in formal attire that cost more than most people earned in a year, his coat tailored to accommodate the weapons he wore beneath it, because attending a political gathering unarmed was how men ended up dead in elegant surroundings. Beside him, Cedric looked almost like his old self, the scars hidden beneath expensive fabric, the damage concealed by the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from generations of inherited certainty. And Serafina. Serafina stood between them wearing a dress that Lucien had commissioned from the finest seamstress in Ravenshire, silver silk that caught light like water-reflecting stars, cut to emphasize her strength rather than hide it. She'd refused the first three designs as too soft, too decorative, too much like costumes nobility wore to pretend they were something other than predators in expensive clothing. The fourth had made her smile, and Lucien had paid triple to have it finished in time. She looked like revolution wrapped in elegance, like the street rat who'd defied a duke grown into the woman who'd stand beside him while he dismantled England's power structure. "You ready for this?" Her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear. "No." Lucien's honesty surprised them both. "But I'm doing it anyway. Readiness is overrated. Commitment is what matters." Very philosophical for someone about to trigger political warfare. "Your influence." Lucien's smile was genuine. "You're teaching me that sometimes the right thing and the smart thing look different but lead to the same place eventually." The doors opened. They entered the grand hall like an invasion force dressed for dinner. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned. The weight of England's aristocratic attention focused on the Duke of Ravenshire and the two people flanking him, one a ghost returned from death, the other a woman who had no business standing among nobility but did it anyway, with her chin lifted like she owned the room. Lucien scanned the crowd, cataloging reactions. Shock at Cedric's presence, confusion about Serafina's identity, calculation in the eyes of men who were already wondering what this meant for their political positions. And there, near the raised platform where announcements would be made, the Harcourt family cluster looking like they'd just watched their carefully constructed world begin collapsing. Lord Edmund Harcourt's arm was in a sling, his face still showing bruises from the warehouse fight. Lady Evelyn stood beside her father, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched tight enough to whiten knuckles. Behind them, the parliamentary allies who'd helped orchestrate 20 years of conspiracy suddenly looked like men realizing they'd bet on the wrong outcome. Lord Harwick materialized from the crowd, his face carrying the kind of grim satisfaction that came from watching enemies get what they deserved. "Your Grace, everything is prepared. The evidence is ready for presentation. The witnesses are positioned. When you give the word, we proceed." "No." Lucien's voice was quiet. "Not yet. First, I have something else to do." He walked through this crowd with Serafina on his arm, aware of the whispers following their progress like ripples spreading from stones dropped in still water. Climbed the steps to the raised platform where England's most important announcements were made, where marriages were formalized and alliances sealed, and the future of the kingdom got negotiated in front of witnesses who'd spread the news before morning. The hall fell silent. Lucien looked out at the assembled nobility, at generations of inherited power and political manipulation, and the careful games that kept certain families on top while others struggled for scraps. He'd been born into this world, raised to understand its rules, taught to play the game better than anyone else, because second place in aristocratic politics was just another word for dead. And now he was about to break every rule that mattered. "My lords and ladies," his voice carried to the far corners of the hall without effort, "thank you for attending tonight's assembly. I know many of you came expecting an announcement of my engagement to Lady Evelyn Harcourt, a union that would have strengthened political alliances and secured trade agreements beneficial to multiple parties." The crowd murmured agreement. This was familiar territory. Expected progression. "Unfortunately, that announcement won't be happening." Lucien's smile was cold. Because Lady Evelyn's family has spent the last 20 years engaged in conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder designed to seize control of Ravenshire through manipulation instead of legitimate means. The murmur became a roar. Lucian raised his hand for silence and somehow got it. 20 years ago, my father, Lord Cedric Mordain, was ambushed on the northern road. His men were slaughtered. He was taken prisoner. The Harcourt family arranged the entire incident, then kept him imprisoned for 2 years before he escaped. They wanted him gone because he refused to agree to a marriage alliance that would have given them influence over Ravenshire's resources and strategic position. Impossible. Edmund's voice cut through the hall. Lord Cedric died in that ambush. His body was recovered. We all attended his funeral. You attended the funeral of an empty casket. Lucian gestured to his father. Because the man you tried to kill survived, escaped, and spent 18 years gathering evidence of your family's crimes while watching to ensure his son could protect himself before risking return. Cedric stepped forward, and the hall erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted questions. Guards moved toward the platform. Parliamentary officials demanded order while simultaneously trying to process implications that would reshape England's political landscape if proven true. And through it all, the Harcourt family stood frozen like prey animals watching predators close in. Lucien let the chaos build for exactly 30 seconds before speaking again, his voice cutting through the noise with authority earned through years of making people listen or suffer consequences. I have documentation. Financial records showing irregular payments from the Harcourt estate to known mercenaries during the months surrounding my father's disappearance. Witness statements from servants who saw Lord Cedric held prisoner on Harcourt property. Testimony from guards who were paid to maintain his captivity and silence. All fabricated. Edmund's face had gone pale. Forged documents designed to destroy my family's reputation because the Duke of Ravenshire cannot accept a woman's rejection of his marriage proposal. I never proposed. Lucien's smile was all teeth. Your daughter came to me 2 days ago and confessed your entire plot, including the planned assassination attempt during this assembly. She provided names of your parliamentary allies, details of your conspiracy, and evidence that corroborates everything my father survived. Every eye turned to Evelyn. She stood frozen for exactly 3 heartbeats before her shoulders straightened and she met Lucien's gaze with something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. It's true. Her voice carried despite its softness. All of it. My family orchestrated Lord Cedric's kidnapping. They've spent 20 years positioning for control of Ravenshire, and they planned to kill Duke Lucien during this assembly if he didn't agree to terms that would have made them the real power behind the duchy. Evelyn, shut your mouth. Edmund's command came out strangled. No. She turned to face her father. I'm done being your chess piece. Done pretending that political power justifies murder. Done watching you destroy people and calling it strategy. You wanted me raised to be the perfect duchess. Congratulations. I learned enough about honor and duty to recognize when my own family has none. The hall exploded into accusations and denials and the sound of political alliances crumbling in real time. Lucien watched it unfold with the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 2 days preparing for exactly this chaos. Parliamentary officials swarmed the Harcourt family, demanding answers, making arrests, beginning the process that would strip them of titles and property and everything they'd murdered to obtain. Edmund shouted about injustice and fabricated evidence and conspiracies against his house, but nobody was listening anymore. Not when Lord Cedric Mordain stood alive as proof that the Harcourts had lied about everything. Harwick appeared at Lucian's elbow. Your Grace, Parliament is demanding you submit all evidence for official investigation. They're also requesting you accept temporary oversight of Harcourt properties until permanent arrangements can be made. Tell them I accept their requests. Lucian's eyes never left the chaos. And Harwick, make sure Evelyn is protected. She chose truth over family loyalty. That deserves consideration. Generous of you, Your Grace. Considering she was part of the conspiracy originally. She was 10 years old when this started. Lucian finally looked at his advisor. She didn't choose her family any more than I chose mine. Difference is, she found the courage to break away when it mattered. That's worth protecting. The hall slowly organized itself into some semblance of order as guards escorted the Harcourt family out under arrest. Nobles clustered in groups discussing implications and already positioning for whatever power vacuum this created. Parliamentary officials scattered to begin investigations that would consume months and ruin dozens of political careers built on association with the Harcourt conspiracy. And through it all, Serafina stood beside Lucien like an anchor in storm, her presence steady and solid, and somehow the only thing that felt real in a room full of performance and calculation. "You did it." Her voice carried quiet amazement. "You actually destroyed them." "We destroyed them." Lucien's hand found hers. "You saved my father, defied me when defiance was the right choice. Refused to let me treat you like a tactical problem instead of a person. This doesn't happen without you. I just helped a dying man. Everything else was your choice." "Exactly." Lucien turned to face her fully, aware that the entire hall was watching but finding he didn't care anymore. "You gave me the choice, showed me what it looked like to choose right over easy. And because of that, I'm making another choice right now. In front of England's entire nobility, in front of Parliament and power brokers, and everyone who thinks they know how the game is played." "What choice?" Serafina's eyes widened as Lucien went to one knee. "The choice to stop treating love like weakness and start treating it like the strongest thing I've ever encountered." He pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple silver band without the ostentation nobility usually preferred. "Serafina Vale, you're not nobility. You have no title, no political connections, no strategic value whatsoever in the games these people play. And you're the only person in this entire hall who's shown me that those things don't matter as much as courage and principle and the willingness to stand for what's right, even when it costs everything. Lucien." Her voice came out choked. "Will you marry me? Not because it serves any political purpose, not because it strengthens alliances or secures trade routes, but because somewhere between you pulling a knife on me and me choosing your life over tactical advantage, I fell in love with the woman who taught me that the Iron Duke doesn't have to stay iron to stay strong." The hall held its breath. Serafina looked down at him with tears running down her face, her expression caught between laughter and disbelief, and something that looked like hope, daring to believe in possibilities. "You're insane. This will cause political chaos. Parliament can burn." Lucien's smile was genuine. "I've spent 20 years making choices based on what they think and what power demands and what strategy requires. For once in my life, I'm making a choice based purely on what I want. And I want you. If you'll have a man who spent most of his life being a monster and is just now learning how to be human again." "Yes." The word came out fierce. "Yes. Of course, yes. You brilliant, damaged, impossible man. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that made the assembled nobility gasp in scandalized delight, because the Duke of Ravenshire had just proposed to a woman with no title in front of everyone who mattered, and clearly didn't care what they thought about it. When they finally broke apart, Lucien turned to face the crowd with Serafina's hand in his, both of them united against whatever judgment came next. The hall erupted into applause, not universal. Some nobles looked offended. Some appeared calculating what this meant for their own political positions. But enough genuine approval rang through the space that Lucien realized something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent 20 years ruling through fear, and in one night he'd shown them something different. Shown them that the Iron Duke could break his own rules and the kingdom wouldn't collapse. That strength and mercy could coexist. That choosing love over strategy wasn't weakness, but maybe the bravest thing a man in his position could do. Cedric appeared beside them, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Welcome back, son. I've been waiting 20 years to see this version of you again. I'm not the same person I was." Lucien's voice was quiet. "No. You're better. You're what I could have been if I'd figured out how to balance mercy with the strength to protect it." Cedric's hand gripped both their shoulders. "And you're what she helped you become by refusing to accept the monster as all you were." The celebration continued around them, but Lucien found himself stepping back from it, needing air that didn't taste like political maneuvering and social calculation. He led Serafina to the balcony overlooking Ravenshire. The city spread beneath them like a kingdom he'd spent his life protecting and only now realized he'd been seeing wrong the entire time. "What are you thinking?" Serafina leaned against the railing beside him. "That I've been ruling this city for 20 years and never really looked at it." Lucien gestured to the lights below. "Never saw the people, just threats and resources and tactical considerations. Never understood that power without humanity is just another word for tyranny wearing a crown. And now, Now I'm thinking about what Ravenshire could become if the Duke actually cared about the people instead of just protecting his position. Lucien's hand covered hers. What kind of duchy we could build if we stopped treating poverty like individual failure and started treating it like systemic problem requiring actual solutions. You're talking about reform. Serafina's eyes sparkled. The Iron Duke is talking about mercy and social change. The Iron Duke is talking about learning from the woman who saved his father and taught him that strength without compassion is just brutality by another name. Lucien turned to face her. I don't know how to do this. How to be the kind of leader who inspires instead of terrifies. But I want to learn, and I want you beside me while I figure it out. Always. She kissed him again, soft and certain. But fair warning. I'm going to push you, challenge you, remind you when you start sliding back into old patterns. I'm counting on it. Lucien's smile was genuine. That's why I asked you to marry me instead of someone who'd just agree with everything I said. They stood there watching Ravenshire settle into night. Two people from completely different worlds who'd found each other in circumstances that should have made connection impossible. Below them, the city carried on with its rhythms, unaware yet that something fundamental had shifted in the castle above. That the Duke who'd ruled through fear for 20 years had just chosen love in front of everyone who mattered. That change was coming not through revolution, but through evolution. One choice at a time, one mercy extended, one moment of connection valued over tactical advantage. Inside the hall, Cedric watched his son through the balcony windows and allowed himself to believe that maybe suffering had purpose after all. That 20 years of hell had been the price paid so Lucien could learn lessons that would have destroyed a softer man. That everything, the kidnapping, the escape, the years in hiding, the return, had been necessary to bring them to this moment where the Iron Duke finally remembered he was human first and ruler second. Lord Harwick appeared beside him. Your Grace, I've served your family for 40 years, watched you rule, watched your son become something terrifying, and tonight I watched him become something better. I'm not sure I understand how it happened. Love happened. Cedric's voice was quiet, the one force powerful enough to break through armor forged from 20 years of necessary brutality. My son spent his entire adult life protecting himself from betrayal. And then he met a woman who showed him that not everyone with access to your heart uses it as weakness to exploit. She's remarkable. Harwick watched Serafina on the balcony. No title, no connections, just courage and principles she refused to compromise. Like someone else I used to know. Cedric smiled. My wife would have loved her, would have recognized the same fire that made her marry a duke against her family's wishes because she believed in building something better than tradition dictated. Your Grace, what happens now? The advisor's question carried weight. The Harcourts are destroyed. Parliament is in chaos. Every political alliance in England is being reassessed. And the Duke of Ravenshire just announced he's marrying a woman with no strategic value whatsoever. The landscape has changed in ways I'm not sure anyone can predict. Good. Cedric's eyes never left his son. Predictability is just another word for stagnation. Maybe England needs chaos. Maybe Ravenshire needs a duke who cares more about being right than being feared. Maybe we all need to remember that the future doesn't have to look like the past, just because that's how it's always been. The winter assembly wound down in the early morning hours, nobles departing with enough gossip to fuel political speculation for years. The Harcourt family's fall would reshape England's power structure. Cedric's return would require parliamentary investigation and legal maneuvering to restore his official status. And the Duke of Ravenshire's engagement to a commoner would inspire everything from romantic admiration to scandalized outrage depending on who was asked. But in the quiet hours after everyone left, Lucien found himself back in his study with Serafina curled in the chair across from his desk and Cedric standing by the window watching dawn break over Ravenshire. It's done. Lucien's voice carried exhaustion earned through days of planning and hours of public performance. The Harcourts are destroyed. You're officially alive again, and I've committed political suicide by proposing to a woman Parliament will spend months arguing shouldn't be Duchess. Best political suicide I've ever witnessed. Cedric's smile was genuine. Your mother would have loved the scandal. Tell me about her. Serafina's request was soft. I should know something about the woman whose legacy I'm stepping into. She was fierce. Cedric's voice gentled with memory. Born to nobility, but hated everything it represented. Used to sneak out of her family's estate to help in the lower city. That's how we met. I found her in a soup kitchen serving food to people my father called unworthy of consideration. She told me that nobility without compassion was just inherited arrogance. I married her 6 months later.
Sounds like someone I know. Lucien's eyes found Serafina. Defiant, principled, completely unwilling to accept that the world has to be cruel just because it always has been.
I'll take that as a compliment.
She stood, moving to the window beside Cedric. What was her name?
Catherine.
Cedric's hand pressed against the glass. She died giving birth to a daughter who didn't survive either. I lost them both in one night and nearly lost myself in the grief. Spent years afterward trying to rule the way she would have wanted, with mercy and wisdom and the belief that power should serve people instead of just protecting itself. And then they took you. Lucien's voice was quiet. And I spent 20 years becoming everything she would have hated because I thought it was the only way to survive. She wouldn't have hated you. Cedric turned to face his son. She would have understood, would have recognized that you did what you had to do with the information you had, would have been proud that you're capable of changing when you finally learned there were other options.
I'm not sure I've changed.
Lucien stood, moving to join them. I'm not sure one night of choosing differently erases 20 years of brutality. It doesn't. Serafina's hand found his. But it's a start. And starting is the hardest part. Everything after is just practice and patience and choosing the same thing over and over until it becomes natural instead of effort. They stood together watching Ravenshire wake beneath them, 3 people bound by blood and choice, and the recognition that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the daily decision to be better than circumstance demanded. The months that followed were harder than Lucien anticipated and easier than he feared. Parliament accepted Cedric's return after investigation confirmed every detail of his testimony. The Harcourt estates were seized and distributed among families who'd suffered from their conspiracy. Dr. Winters was tried for treason and hanged while maintaining to the end that he'd only taken the Harcourt money to fund medical research that would have saved lives. Evelyn Harcourt disappeared into the countryside under a new name, her testimony having purchased exile instead of execution. Rumor said she'd opened a school for girls from poor families, teaching them to read and calculate and recognize when men tried to use them as chess pieces. And Lucien married Serafina in a ceremony that scandalized half of England's nobility and inspired the other half to reconsider what strength actually meant when applied to leadership instead of just military conquest. The wedding took place in Ravenshire's cathedral on a spring morning when the world looked like it had remembered how to be beautiful. Serafina wore silver silk that caught light like water over stones. Lucien wore formal attire that he'd commissioned specifically to have pockets for the knife he still carried because some habits died harder than others. And Cedric stood beside his son as witness to the moment when the Iron Duke chose love over every tactical consideration that had ruled his life. When the ceremony ended and they walked out into sunshine that felt like blessing, Lucien found himself thinking about his mother, wondering if Catherine Mordain was somewhere watching her damaged son, finally learning the lessons she'd died before she could teach him, wondering if she'd approve of Serafina or think Lucien was still too broken to deserve someone that whole. "What are you thinking?" Serafina's question pulled him back to the present, that I spent 20 years being exactly what survival demanded. Lucien's hand tightened on hers. And now I get to spend however long I have left learning to be what love allows. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Good. She smiled. Terrified means you're taking it seriously. Liberated means you're finally letting yourself hope. Both are necessary if you're going to be the kind of Duke Ravenshire actually needs instead of just the kind it learned to fear. They walked through streets lined with people who'd come to witness their Duke marrying a woman who'd lived among them, who understood their struggles, who'd chosen to stand with power instead of being crushed by it. The cheers that followed them weren't the fearful respect Lucien had grown accustomed to over 20 years of iron rule. They were genuine celebration from people who sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the castle above them. That evening, Lucien stood in his study looking at the maps and documents that had consumed so much of his life. Trade routes, military positions, political alliances, all the mechanisms of power he'd learned to manipulate like instruments in an orchestra playing a single note for 2 decades. Serafina found him there as the sun set, her wedding dress exchanged for something simpler but no less striking. Planning already. Her voice carried amusement. We've been married for 8 hours, and you're back to being the Duke instead of being my husband. I'm always the Duke. Lucien turned to face her. That doesn't change just because I learned to be human again. No. But maybe the Duke can learn to serve instead of just rule. She moved to the desk, studying the maps. Maybe power can be used to lift people up instead of just keeping them controlled. You're talking about reform again. Comprehensive changes to how Ravenshire operates. I'm talking about using everything you learned during 20 years of brutal efficiency and applying it to actual problems instead of just maintaining control. Seraphina's finger traced the lower city on the map. You know every street, every building, every weak point in your domain. What if you use that knowledge to build instead of just protect? Lucien studied her, this woman who'd saved his father and captured his heart, and was now proposing to reshape everything he'd built. The smart play would be resisting. Change invited chaos. Reform created instability. Every tactical instinct he possessed screamed that tradition existed because it worked, and deviation led to collapse. But he'd spent 20 years making the smart play, and it had nearly destroyed him. What did you have in mind? His question was surrender disguised as curiosity. Seraphina's smile was brilliant as sunrise. Everything. I have everything in mind, and if you're half the man I think you are, you're going to help me build it. They spent that night planning a future that looked nothing like the past, two people from different worlds creating something new from the rubble of what had been. And somewhere in the castle, Cedric listened to their voices carrying through stone corridors and allowed himself to believe that his suffering had purchased something worth the price. That his son had finally learned the lesson Catherine had tried to teach them both. That power without purpose was just another word for tyranny. That strength meant nothing if it couldn't protect what mattered. That love was the only force in the universe powerful enough to transform monsters back into men. The Iron Duke had ruled through fear for 20 years. Now he would learn to rule through something better. And Ravenshire would either rise with him or watch him fail trying. Either way, the choice was made. The fortress would become a home. The tyrant would become a husband. And the man who'd spent 2 decades believing that caring about anything was weakness would discover that caring about everything was the strongest thing he'd ever done.